Have you ever wondered what mysteries, treasures, and forgotten stories our world still hides beneath the sands of time? Welcome to Timeless Secrets, the channel where we uncover the most fascinating artifacts, ancient wonders, and hidden histories from across the globe. Hit subscribe for 10 years of good luck, drop a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. The Lyuba Mammoth, beneath the frozen earth of Siberia, where winter seems to stretch forever and the winds howl across desolate tundra plains, there lies a secret world, one locked away for tens of thousands of years. The ice preserves stories that time itself has long since forgotten, and among its most haunting treasures is the tiny, fragile body of a mammoth calf, known today as Lyuba. Lyuba is no ordinary fossil. She is not a collection of bones, shattered and scattered by time. She is whole. Her skin, her trunk, even the gentle curve of her eyelashes have been frozen into eternity. She lived and died nearly 42,000 years ago, yet when she was discovered, she appeared to be only sleeping, a child of the Ice Age who had somehow slipped across the gulf of millennia to rest at our feet. It was the spring of 2007 when a reindeer herder named Yuri Kuti and his sons noticed something protruding from the muddy banks of the Urabay River on the Yamal Peninsula in northwestern Siberia. At first glance, it seemed like a strange, pale log, waterlogged and half-buried. But as they approached, they saw the unmistakable form of a trunk. They had stumbled upon something unimaginable, the most complete mammoth ever discovered. Lyuba, named after Yuri's wife, was a baby female woolly mammoth, only about a month old when she died. She stood just 85 centimeters tall at the shoulder, weighed around 50 kilograms, and had only just begun her brief life in the icy steppe landscape of Ice Age Siberia. The people who found her quickly understood her value, not as food or ivory, but as a messenger from a lost world. Scientists would later confirm that she was preserved so perfectly that even her mother's milk could still be detected in her stomach. Imagine her world. It was the Pleistocene epoch, a time when colossal animals roamed the open steppes. Herds of mammoths trudged across the land, their long hair swaying in the wind as they searched for grasses beneath the snow. Woolly rhinoceroses plodded nearby, their horns curved like scythes. Reindeer, steppe bison, musk oxen, cave lions, and even saber-toothed cats prowled the landscape. The humans who lived there were small in number, scattered bands of hunter-gatherers making their way through an unforgiving world. For them, mammoths were both prey and spiritual symbols, creatures of immense power and meaning. But Lyuba would never grow old enough to know that world. She died young, so young that her teeth had only just begun to erupt. Evidence suggests she may have suffocated, perhaps trapped in mud and silt as she followed her herd across a riverbank. Her body sank quickly, sealed by the cold, shielded from scavengers and decay. The permafrost wrapped around her like a cocoon, locking her away until chance brought her back to the light of day. When scientists finally studied her, they were astonished by her condition. She still had fur clinging to her small frame, her skin pliable and intact. Inside her mouth, remnants of her mother's milk lingered, frozen in time. In her trunk, traces of silt revealed how she had inhaled mud in her final moments. Even her organs, her blood vessels, and the folds of her brain remained preserved. Lyuba was more than a fossil. She was a child frozen in mid-breath. Her discovery opened an unprecedented window into the Ice Age. For decades, mammoths had been known only through scattered tusks and partial skeletons, their bones bleaching on riverbanks or eroding from cliffs. Lyuba changed everything. She was a blueprint for the mammoth body, a perfect specimen for scientists to study the biology of an animal long extinct. Through her we learned about the milk that mammoth calves drank, the kinds of microbes that lived in their guts, and even the fat reserves they carried to survive the cold. Scientists were able to look into her eyes, preserved as if she might open them at any moment. They traced the pathways of blood in her heart. They studied the structure of her tiny lungs. In every detail she carried answers to questions that had lingered for centuries. What did mammoth skin feel like? How did their bodies adapt to freezing climates? What did their muscles look like beneath all that hair? Lyuba offered it all. And yet, there is also something deeply haunting about her. To see her body today is to be caught between two emotions: scientific wonder and human sadness. She is breathtaking in her completeness, but she is also a child lost. Her story one of abrupt ending. In that tension lies her power. Lyuba makes the Ice Age real, in a way that bones never could. She makes us remember that mammoths were not just prehistoric monsters of imagination, but living, breathing beings, each with lives that began and ended, just like ours. Her discovery also reminds us of the extraordinary role of permafrost as the keeper of memory. In the frozen soil of Siberia, time collapses. Animals that walked the earth when glaciers still covered Europe, when early humans painted in caves by flickering firelight, can reappear almost unchanged. Lyuba is part of a silent army of the past, lying beneath the tundra. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, even lions and bisons, waiting for the ice to shift, for rivers to erode, for the sun to melt the permafrost, just enough to reveal them. For the people who lived alongside mammoths, creatures like Lyuba were at the center of existence. Carvings of mammoths have been found in ivory and bone, etched by human hands over 30,000 years ago. Their massive tusks became tools, their hides became shelter, their bones became the very architecture of survival. And yet those same people must have looked at mammoths with awe. These were animals as vast as myths, walking the earth with the weight of eternity in their step. Lyuba, as a calf, might have scampered between the legs of such giants, learning how to follow her herd, testing the strength of her trunk. But the mammoths would not last forever. Climate warmed, grasslands shrank, and humans grew more skilled at hunting. By around 4,000 years ago, the last small populations of mammoths vanished from isolated islands in the Arctic. The world grew quieter without their thunder, and yet in Lyuba's stillness, their story continues to breathe. Her preservation has even raised the possibility of bringing mammoths back. Scientists studying her DNA, and others like her, imagine a future where mammoth traits could be reintroduced into modern elephants, a form of de-extinction. The idea is controversial, raising ethical questions about what it means to revive a species that nature has already let go. But Lyuba, more than any other, fuels that dream. She is a reminder not just of loss, but of possibility, of the knowledge still locked in the ice, waiting to be read, and so, she rests now in controlled preservation, carefully watched over so that she may endure for generations to come. Visitors who see her describe an almost surreal experience, to stand in front of a being that died 42,000 years ago, and yet still seems so close, so present. Lyuba bridges the gap between past and present, in a way few discoveries ever could. Her story is more than the tale of a mammoth. It is the story of memory, of what the earth can hold when it refuses to forget. She was a child of the Ice Age, gone too soon, but in her small form, she carries the echoes of a vanished world. And through her, we are reminded that history is not just something written in stone or clay, but something fragile and alive, waiting beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when time and chance bring it back to light. Lyuba, the tiny mammoth calf, continues to sleep, her eyes closed, her body curled. She is a lullaby from the deep past, whispering across the millennia, and in her silence she tells us that the world remembers more than we know, that even in death there is story, and in ice there is life everlasting. The copper bull figurines of Tel Olubide, beneath the dry shifting sands of southern Mesopotamia, where the desert wind still sighs across ancient tells, those great mounds of earth that hide millennia of human history. There lies a place once alive with devotion, ritual, and craftsmanship. Tel Olubide, a modest rise not far from the city of holds within its soil an offering that continues to puzzle and fascinate archaeologists to this day. Small but powerful figurines of copper, shaped into the forms of sacred bulls. They are not large, not monumental, but in their size, they hold a weight of meaning that reaches back over 5,000 years, into a world where gods were close, offerings were necessary, and metal itself was a medium of power. The discovery of these copper bulls is one of those moments in archaeology when time seems to fold in on itself. Imagine the archaeologists brushing carefully at a layer of compacted earth, the air heavy and still, the sun burning down as always in the Mesopotamian plain. Then, suddenly, a shine, dull at first, then gleaming green with age, the unmistakable curve of a horn, the suggestion of a muzzle, a body formed not in clay, as so many ancient figures were, but in hammered copper. Such objects could not have been mere decorations. They were carefully fashioned, imbued with meaning, and laid down as offerings to forces larger than life itself. To understand these figurines, one must first step back into the world of the Ubaid and early Sumerian cultures that thrived in this region around the 5th millennium BCE. This was the dawn of settled life in southern Mesopotamia, when communities gathered not only to farm and fish along the fertile rivers, but also to build temples, to fashion new tools and weapons from copper, and to experiment with rituals that bound their people together. Cattle, both real and symbolic, occupied a central role in this world. To the people of ancient Mesopotamia, the bull was more than an animal. It was strength, it was fertility. It was a living symbol of vitality, connected to the life-giving rivers, to the cycles of agriculture, and to the power of the gods themselves. It is no surprise, then, that the bull appears again and again in Mesopotamian art, architecture, and myth. Later we see it standing guard in the colossal Lamassu statues of Assyria, or charging in mythological tales alongside the gods. But here, at Tel Olubide, the bull appears in miniature, preserved not in stone but in copper, that newly mastered metal which to the ancients gleamed with almost divine radiance. When Leonard Woolley excavated the site in the early 20th century, he was already famous for his discoveries at Yet the finds at Tel Olubide carried their own peculiar resonance. Within the ruins of what was once a temple, these copper bulls emerged, lying where they had been placed thousands of years earlier. Some were stylized, with long sweeping horns and compact bodies. Others were more naturalistic, echoing the musculature and stance of the real animals. All were carefully positioned, as though they had been offerings given to a god whose identity we may never know, but whose presence dominated the temple. The temple itself was dedicated to Ninhursag, the great mother goddess, the bringer of fertility and the sustainer of life. If the bulls were placed there in her honor, the meaning grows clearer. They were emblems of her power, stand-ins for the strength of the herds, the cycles of reproduction, the wealth and survival of her people. To offer a bull figurine of copper was no small thing. It meant surrendering not just the labor of the smith, but also a piece of the community's wealth. For copper was precious, imported from distant lands, hammered and shaped with care. The figurines, in their stillness, became a permanent prayer. Think of them as frozen rituals. Each figurine, perhaps, was carried into the temple by priests, accompanied by chants and incense, by the rhythmic beat of drums echoing against mud-brick walls. They may have been set down at altars, placed within niches, or buried beneath the floor as enduring tokens of devotion. When we see them today, lying in museum cases, it is easy to forget that they were once alive with ceremony, glowing in torchlight, radiating their metallic sheen beneath the eyes of the goddess's image. And yet questions remain. Were these figurines part of a larger tradition? Were they meant to replace the sacrifice of real animals, standing in symbolically for bulls that could not be killed? Or were they supplements to such sacrifices, intended to endure when flesh and bone would decay? Scholars debate, but the truth is elusive. The figurines whisper, but do not explain. They remind us that the language of the past is often symbolic, layered, and only partly accessible to us now. The copper itself is telling. To work copper required skill, fire, and trade. Southern Mesopotamia had no native sources of the metal. It had to be brought in, likely from the mountains of Iran or Anatolia. That meant networks of exchange, long caravans of goods moving across deserts and rivers. To fashion copper into the form of a bull was, therefore, to condense both the strength of the animal and the reach of the community's connections into one shining image. It was a statement. We have the strength of bulls, the favor of the gods, and the wealth to acquire and shape the metal of the earth. Close your eyes and imagine the figurine as it once was. Not green with the patina of centuries, but bright, almost golden in the firelight. Its horns gleaming, its body polished smooth by the hand of the smith. It may have been small enough to carry, but in that moment it was as mighty as a living bull. Around it, voices rose in prayer. Offerings of grain and oil burned. The scent of livestock and incense mingled, and the copper bull, still and silent, received it all as a vessel of meaning. Over time, the figurines became buried, whether deliberately or by the collapse of the temple itself. They lay in darkness for millennia, the copper slowly reacting with the soil, their shine fading, their forms preserved in silence. When they were uncovered, the world that had made them was gone, yet the bulls endure, carrying across time their strange, compelling presence. There is a haunting quality to them. Unlike statues of kings or reliefs of battles, they do not speak of power in human terms. They speak of something more primal, more enduring, the relationship between humans, animals, and gods. They speak of a world where survival itself was sacred, and where every harvest, every calf born, was both a miracle and a necessity. The copper bulls are, in this way, the distilled essence of early religion. They are the physical echoes of prayers that once filled the air of Mesopotamia. As you let the image of these figurines settle in your mind, think of how fragile they are, and yet how enduring. Copper can corrode, but the shapes remain. The beliefs of the people who made them have vanished, but their gestures live on in these offerings. The bulls continue to stand, horns raised, bodies poised, their purpose both clear and mysterious. They remind us of the depth of human devotion, of the care with which our ancestors gave shape to their hopes and fears, and of the strange endurance of objects across the gulf of time. Tel Olubaid may appear now as a mound of dust beneath the sun, but within its soil, within the copper bulls, lies a whole world of faith and ritual, a world that still speaks if you listen closely enough. The Lord of the Rings of Sippar. The desert wind moves slowly across the low plains of ancient Mesopotamia, carrying with it the scent of dry dust, faint salt from distant marshes, and the soft whisper of sand sliding across stone. Once, long ago, this place was alive with voices. Men, women, children, oxen, and donkeys filled the streets, their footsteps echoing between brick walls sun-baked into permanence. The city was Sippar, a name that in its own time carried weight and wonder, a jewel among the settlements strung along the Euphrates. And within this city, beneath its temple shadows, and at the very heart of its devotion, there existed an object so small that it could be held in one hand, yet so powerful that it claimed eternity as its own. This was the cylinder seal of Shamash, the sun god, the lord of light, etched in copper and stone, pressed again and again into wet clay to declare law, to bind prayer, to seal fate. It has been called, in later imaginations, the Lord of the Rings of Sippar. The people of Sippar lived their days under the burning gaze of the Mesopotamian sun, which rose each morning, like a watchful guardian. To them the sun was not simply light, nor merely warmth, it was order itself. The sun's steady journey across the sky mirrored the passage of justice, the balance of truth, the unflinching eye of Shamash. Farmers sowed grain beneath that steady heat. Judges lifted their hands swearing oaths beneath its brilliance. Kings appealed to Shamash when they sought divine sanction for their rule. And scribes bent over damp clay tablets traced out the marks of language, pressing styluses into clay softened by the sun's heat, waiting to roll the seal of Shamash across the wet surface to make the invisible visible, to mark the words as truth and decree. Imagine the object itself. A cylinder seal, not much taller than a thumb, made of hard stone, its surface painstakingly carved with images that never faded. To modern eyes it may look small, even modest, yet to the ancient inhabitants it was immeasurable in weight. Upon it was carved the image of Shamash himself, enthroned, with rays bursting from his shoulders like spears of light. Before him, worshippers raised their hands in reverence, priests approached with gifts, and sacred symbols framed the divine presence. When rolled across clay, these figures came alive, unspooling in miniature across the tablet, an eternal procession in perfect lines. The seal did not simply decorate, it declared the presence of the god, turning mere clay into sacred testimony. To touch it, to use it, was to call upon Shamash himself to witness the truth of words. Sippar's temple dedicated to Shamash was no ordinary building, known as the Ebobar, the shining house. It was a gleaming monument to light itself. Its walls rose high from mud brick foundations, plastered white so that they reflected the sun with almost unbearable brightness. Within its courtyards, priests moved in measured rhythm, chanting hymns in the morning as the first rays pierced the horizon, and in the evening as the sun dipped low beyond the date palms and reeds. Clay tablets record the immense holdings of this temple, fields, canals, herds, and workers, all devoted to sustaining its rituals. Yet in the heart of this shining house, among altars heavy with incense and offerings of bread, copper and wool, lay the sacred objects, the seals and figures that connected the city directly to its god. The cylinder seal of Shamash was one of these treasures. To understand its significance, one must imagine the life of those who approached it. Consider a scribe, trained from childhood in the tablet house, the Eduba, where he memorized cuneiform signs until his stylus hand cramped and his eyes blurred. He learned not only to copy words, but to shape them with authority. Now grown, he kneels before a clay tablet freshly pressed flat. On it are recorded the words of a land dispute, two farmers arguing over a field boundary where the canal bends. Without sanction, these are only scratches in clay, but with the impression of the Shamash seal, they become law, backed by divine justice. The scribe lifts the seal carefully, breath held, and rolls it across the surface. A procession of divine images appears, each detail sharp, as though Shamash himself had touched the tablet. The dispute is no longer merely human, it is overseen by the sun god. Both parties bow. The seal has spoken. The awe of the seal was not only in law but in myth. For Shamash was not simply the sun, he was the all-seeing judge. The epic tales whispered by storytellers at Sippar's gates told how Shamash traveled daily across the heavens in a golden chariot, pulled by fiery steeds. At night he descended into the underworld, lighting its darkness, judging spirits, ensuring balance even among the dead. To possess his seal was to carry a fragment of that journey, a miniature emblem of cosmic order. The people believed that lies could not stand where Shamash was invoked, for nothing could hide from the sun's gaze. And so, in Sippar, where sunlight seemed eternal and the fields glowed with golden grain, the cylinder seal became more than a tool. It was a ring of truth, a band of authority. Its rolling impression was like a turning wheel, binding mortals to gods, time to eternity. The seal was itself a kind of ring, endlessly circling clay, its image repeating in unbroken sequence. That is why later imagination could call it the Lord of the Rings of Sippar, not because it bound kings alone, but because it bound all who sought justice beneath the burning eye of Shamash. The copper that sometimes framed such seals, or that was offered alongside them, carried its own meaning. Copper was a metal of purity, gleaming like sunlight when polished. In Mesopotamian ritual, copper vessels and figurines were left as sacred gifts to gods. To shape Shamash's seal in copper was to reflect the god's own light. Archaeologists who uncovered such pieces in Sippar's soil found them worn smooth by centuries of touch, as though countless hands had caressed their surfaces in reverence. The air of the temple must once have carried the faint metallic tang of copper offerings, mixed with the rich smoke of burning cedar brought from distant mountains. Sippar itself, though now little more than ruins buried beneath earth, was in its day a city of learning. Scribes there copied the Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribing humanity's oldest stories into tablets that would outlast empires. Within those tales, Shamash appears as protector of heroes, guiding them across deserts, lending them strength against monsters. In one tablet, Shamash aids Gilgamesh and Enkidu as they battle Humbaba, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest. To invoke Shamash was to invoke courage and justice together. Imagine those same stories being recited within Sippar's walls, the seal of Shamash close by, lending weight to the words. Myths and law were not separate, they were threads of the same loom, woven together by divine presence. When archaeologists unearthed the seal of Sippar, they were not merely discovering a piece of art, they were touching a fragment of an entire worldview. The seal had lain buried beneath centuries of collapse, temple stones fallen, roofs caved in, canals dried to dust. Yet when lifted to light once more, its carving still spoke. The god still sat enthroned, rays bursting from his shoulders. The worshippers still raised their hands. The line of justice still unrolled, as if Shamash had only just set his seal upon clay. What is most haunting about such objects is how they carry silence. No sound emerges from the carved figures, yet their stillness is louder than words. The priests who once touched them are gone, their chants dissolved into air. The scribes who once pressed them into clay are dust themselves, their styluses broken long ago, and yet the seal endures. In its miniature scene, time itself seems captured. Every detail is a whisper across thousands of years, saying, "This was how we saw the world." The Lord of the Rings of Sippar, then, is not fantasy, it is history, carved into stone, rolled into clay, preserved by chance and earth. Unlike the rings of legend, which grant invisibility or dominion, this ring-like seal granted presence, the presence of Shamash, the sun that could never be hidden. Its power was not to conceal, but to reveal. That is perhaps the greatest power of all. To imagine Sippar fully, one must picture its horizon. In the early morning, before the heat set in, farmers led oxen into canals glistening with still water, drawing irrigation into thirsty fields. Women gathered reeds from the riverbanks, weaving mats and baskets. Children chased each other along narrow lanes between houses of brick, their laughter sharp against the low hum of insects. Merchants displayed copper ingots, barley and wool, calling to passers-by in voices that mingled with the bray of donkeys. And rising above all, the temple gleamed white against the rising sun, as though itself a second dawn. In its upper rooms, priests prepared incense, sprinkling flour, pouring beer as offerings, while their hands touched the sacred seal that bound the city to its god. The seal, in the end, was more than Sippar's alone. Seals like it traveled across Mesopotamia, marking tablets from Babylon, and Mari. They were passed between merchants on distant trade routes, exchanged as symbols of trust. When pressed into clay, they left behind miniature galleries of gods, kings, and rituals. To hold one was to hold identity itself. Yet Sippar's seal of Shamash held a special place, for Shamash was the judge not of one city, but of all lands touched by sunlight. His seal was a universal witness. And so today, when the object rests behind glass in a museum, far from the desert where it was born, it still carries that quiet authority. Visitors lean close, peering at the fine lines, marveling at how steady the carver's hand must have been thousands of years ago. They read the placard that speaks of Sippar, Shamash, and Mesopotamia. Yet no placard can capture the weight of what it meant to those who first touched it. For them this was not a relic, it was presence, not artifact, but God. The Lord of the Rings of Sippar, the ancient cylinder seal, remains one of the smallest yet greatest testaments to the human longing for order, truth, and light. In its endless rolling images, we see not only the devotion of a city, but the enduring desire to bind the fleeting with the eternal. Across centuries, across silence, the seal still speaks, unbroken, circling forever like the path of the sun itself. The Catalhoyuk wall murals, beneath the warm soils of southern Anatolia, near the Konya Plain in modern-day Turkey, lies a place where the human story first began to take shape in patterns of clay, stone, and color. It is a site called Catalhoyuk, and though it has no towering pyramids, no vast stone avenues, and no glittering palaces, its secrets are older than most cities, stretching back more than 9,000 years. What makes this settlement so extraordinary is not simply the age of its remains, but the art that still clings to its walls, murals of ochre, black and white pigments, painted by people who had only just begun to think of themselves as city dwellers. These are the earliest known city paintings in the world, and through them we glimpse the minds of the Neolithic. Imagine for a moment the landscape around 7000 BCE. The Konya Plain was not the dry stretch of steppe we see today, but rather a fertile expanse dotted with streams, marshes, and wildlife. Herds of wild aurochs roamed the plains, their massive horns glinting in the sun. Small bands of gazelle moved like quicksilver over the grasses. To the south, the looming presence of Mount Hassan, a great volcanic cone, rose over the horizon, and nestled in this world was a vast mound, the Tell of Catalhuyuk, where thousands of people once lived in close quarters. Their homes pressed against each other like honeycombs, with rooftops serving as both streets and gathering spaces. There were no alleyways, no ground-level doors. To enter a house, one climbed down through an opening in the roof. The rooms inside were small, but their walls told stories. The people of Catalhuyuk coated their walls with layers of polished plaster, smoothing them carefully, and then upon these surfaces they painted scenes. These murals were not idle decorations. They were messages, memory, and perhaps ritual, designed to give meaning to the lives lived inside. One of the most famous murals depicts what may be the world's first city map. On a whitewashed wall, dark shapes form clusters of rectangles, interpreted by archaeologists as houses. Above them, a twin-peaked mountain rises, perhaps Mount Hassan itself. Some believe the dots and streaks across the peak show an eruption, a memory of fire and ash spilling down into the plains. If so, then this is not only the earliest city painting, but also the earliest landscape painting, a moment when human beings first thought to capture their environment on a wall. Others argue it may not be a volcano at all, but rather a symbolic pattern, a leopard's skin stretched wide, reminding us that in archaeology, certainty is rare. Elsewhere on the walls, aurochs are painted in bold strokes of red and black. These great wild cattle were central to the symbolic life of Catalhuyuk. Their horns were embedded in walls, mounted like trophies, and sometimes dozens were clustered together in ceremonial rooms. The murals of aurochs often show them charging, surrounded by stick-like figures of humans, spears raised in a hunt. Were these memories of actual hunts, or mythic reenactments of a struggle between humans and the raw forces of the wild? The people who painted them did not leave written explanations, but the energy of the scenes suggests ritual significance, a fusion of life, death, and survival. Another recurring theme is the leopard. Leopards prowled the hills and marshes, dangerous predators to humans. Yet in the murals, they are not always shown as beasts of fear. Instead, they appear paired, flanking central human figures, or stretched out as skins. In one striking mural, a human stands between two massive leopards, arms raised as though in triumph or communion. Was this an image of power, a shamanic figure taming wild forces, or a memory of an ancestor protected by spirits? The symmetry of the composition suggests it was more than an idle sketch. It was iconography, a worldview expressed in pigment. Catalhuyuk was not a small village. At its height, it may have housed up to 8,000 people, living in tightly packed mud brick homes, stacked one against another. Daily life was dense, intimate, and filled with ritual repetition. The dead were buried beneath the floors of the houses, sometimes multiple generations in the same room. Over the graves, the walls were plastered anew, and sometimes painted again. In this way, memory of the ancestors and the rhythm of art were bound together. To live at Catalhuyuk was to walk on the bones of your family, to sleep near their resting place, and to see the walls alive with painted stories that connected the living and the dead. The murals also show abstract patterns, dots, grids, and handprints. These may not be literal depictions of things at all, but symbolic codes, ritual marks, or even the first stirrings of a written system. Some patterns resemble the hides of animals, the ripple of water, or the rhythm of woven textiles. To sit inside one of these rooms, lit by a flickering fire, with red ochre bulls charging across the wall, black leopards crouching in symmetry, and strange dot patterns hovering in between. This would have been an atmosphere thick with meaning. Consider the pigments themselves. Red ochre came from iron-rich earth, carefully ground and mixed with binders. Black likely came from charcoal or manganese. White came from crushed gypsum or lime plaster. These colors had to be prepared, stored, and applied with care. The act of painting itself may have been ritualized, a performance by certain members of the community, perhaps shamans or elders, who carried the authority to mark walls with sacred images. The murals of Catalhuyuk have another remarkable quality. They were renewed again and again. As houses were repaired, plastered, and rebuilt, new layers of art were added over the old. Sometimes dozens of layers of plaster, each with its own faint trace of pigment, lie beneath a single wall. To peel them back is to travel through time, to see centuries of memory compressed in stone and clay. Art here was not static, it was living, layered, and constantly reinterpreted. Archaeologists working at the site since the 1960s have uncovered hundreds of such images. Some walls show vultures with outstretched wings, towering over headless human figures. These are among the most enigmatic murals. Were they depictions of actual sky burials, where bodies were left exposed for birds to consume, as known from other ancient cultures? Or were they symbolic images of the soul's flight, the transformation of death into another state. The vulture murals, like the aurochs hunts and the leopard guardians, suggest that death was a constant presence in the minds of Catalhuyuk's inhabitants, but not one of despair, rather one of passage and meaning. There is also the matter of community. Unlike later cities ruled by kings or priests, Catalhuyuk seems to have had no central hierarchy. The houses are uniform in size. No great palaces or temples dominate the mound. Instead, ritual was embedded in the domestic sphere. Every home was both a living space and a shrine, its walls potential canvases for sacred art. In this way, the murals reflect a society where spirituality and daily life were inseparable. One can imagine a winter night inside a home at Catalhuyuk. A family huddles by the hearth. The firelight flickers on the plaster walls, making the painted bulls appear to move, the leopards to prowl, the vultures to hover. A child stares at the images, listening as an elder tells the story of the hunt, or of the mountain that once erupted, or of the ancestor who became a leopard in spirit. The walls themselves carry the narrative, and the spoken word brings it alive. In such moments, painting, story, and memory fused into one. The murals also tell us about the emerging human need to fix identity in place. These were not wandering bands of hunter-gatherers anymore. These were people who had chosen to settle, to build, to farm, and to bury their dead beneath their floors. The act of painting the walls was, in a sense, the act of declaring, "We belong here." The pigments embedded in plaster were as much a claim of permanence as the bricks themselves. And yet, Catalhuyuk did not last forever. Around 6000 BCE, after centuries of habitation, the mound was gradually abandoned. Climate shifts, resource pressures, or social changes may have driven its people to disperse. But the walls remained, preserved beneath layers of earth, waiting millennia to be uncovered. When archaeologists brushed away the soil, the colors still glowed faintly, telling stories from a world that had never known writing, kings, or monuments, only walls and pigments, memory and meaning. Today, when we gaze upon these murals, we are seeing the earliest stirrings of urban imagination. The first city dwellers sought not just shelter, but also symbolism. Their homes were not only places to cook and sleep, but canvases of belief. The bulls charging across the walls, the leopards flanking a figure, the vultures circling above, these are echoes of how they understood themselves, their ancestors, and their world. And so, the Catalhuyuk wall murals are more than art. They are testimony to the human impulse to create, to remember, and to give shape to meaning, in color and form. They are the voices of the Neolithic, speaking still through the plaster. The Dead Sea Scrolls. The desert is a place of silence. A silence so profound that even the smallest sound, a pebble rolling, a goat's hoof striking stone, the faint whistle of dry wind through a fissure in the rock feels amplified, almost holy. For centuries, the Judean desert has held that silence, broken only by the occasional shepherd, traveler, or wandering mystic. It is a landscape of endless stone, shifting sands, and sun-baked cliffs that conceal more than they reveal. To look at it from afar, one might think it empty. But the desert has a way of hiding secrets, and in its caves and crevices, treasures have lain untouched for millennia, waiting for the right moment to be discovered. One such treasure, the most astonishing of all, was not gold, nor silver, nor jewels. It was words, words inked on parchment and papyrus, rolled into scrolls, sealed in clay jars, and hidden in caves that opened only to the desert sky. Words so old they seemed to bridge heaven and earth, carrying the voices of prophets, scribes, and forgotten communities across a gulf of 2,000 years. Words we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. Their story begins not in libraries, nor in temples, but in the hands of Bedouin shepherds in the late 1940s. Imagine them, young men tending goats among the cliffs near the ruins of Qumran, a crumbling site overlooking the still and shimmering waters of the Dead Sea. The goats wander freely, and one stubborn, perhaps, or curious, scrambles into a narrow crevice high in the cliffside. Frustrated, one shepherd tosses a stone into the dark opening, hoping to flush the animal out. But instead of the thud of rock against rock, he hears something unexpected, the hollow shattering of clay. Climbing into the cave, he finds not his goat but tall jars sealed with lids. Inside them are brittle, rolled-up scrolls wrapped in linen, blackened with age, fragile as dried leaves. He does not know what they are. To him they are strange relics, perhaps valuable, perhaps not. He takes them down the cliffs, uncertain what he holds in his hands. From that moment, the modern story of the Dead Sea Scrolls begins. But their ancient story, the one inked into those parchments, began centuries earlier, in the shadow of empires, in the twilight years of Second Temple Judaism, in a time when Rome, Greece, Persia, and countless local powers wrestled over the lands of Judea. The scrolls themselves contain fragments of nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible, alongside prayers, hymns, apocalyptic visions, and community rules. Some are recognizable to anyone familiar with Scripture. Others are more mysterious. Texts once sacred, later lost, perhaps deliberately forgotten, preserved only by the dry desert air. They speak of angels and sons of light, of purity and punishment, of waiting for a Messiah who would come at the end of days. They are windows into a world where faith, law, and daily life were inseparable, where every sunrise carried cosmic meaning and every act of devotion felt like standing at the edge of eternity. The place where they were found, the caves around Qumran, may have once been home to a sect known as the Essenes. These were a community of Jews who withdrew from the cities and villages, rejecting what they saw as corruption in the Jerusalem temple, choosing instead to live apart, in strict discipline, in the wilderness. They were obsessed with ritual purity, bathing in cold water daily, recording rules with painstaking care, copying scriptures with ink and stylus by lamplight. Their life was austere, simple meals of bread and dates, silence, study, prayer, and preparation for the final battle between light and darkness. If indeed they were the ones who placed the scrolls in jars and carried them into the caves, we can imagine them walking in solemn procession, scrolls held close, climbing the cliffs to hide their sacred writings from invading armies, hoping one day they would be recovered. The desert, of course, kept them far longer than any of them imagined. 2,000 years passed, kingdoms rose and fell, Jerusalem was destroyed and rebuilt. Empires of Rome, Byzantium, Islam, and Christendom swept across the land. The scrolls remained silent witnesses as the world outside turned to dust and then to memory. When scholars first unrolled them, carefully, painfully, they realized what they had. Here were the earliest surviving manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, copied centuries before the versions that had been known until then. The discovery shook the foundations of biblical studies. Until that moment, the oldest Hebrew manuscripts were from the Middle Ages, 1,000 years removed from the days of the prophets. Now, suddenly, the words of Isaiah, the Psalms, Deuteronomy, and countless others leapt back into their ancient form. The consistency was staggering. Though there were small variations, spelling shifts, occasional differences, the heart of the texts had endured almost unchanged across a millennium of copying and transmission. But alongside the familiar were the strange. Texts like the War Scroll, describing an apocalyptic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, the community rule, setting out the laws for life in the desert sect, the Thanksgiving hymns, poetic prayers brimming with gratitude and anguish, even entire psalms unknown in the traditional canon, praising God with words lost for centuries. The more fragments emerged from cave after cave, 11 in all, the deeper the mystery grew. Who exactly had written them? Were they the Essenes? Were they priests fleeing Jerusalem before its fall in 70 CE? Were they a library collected from across Judea and hidden for safekeeping? No single answer satisfied. The scrolls resisted neat categories, much as the desert resists maps. To hold one of these fragments, even today, in a climate-controlled museum in Jerusalem or Amman, is to hold time itself. Imagine a scribe sitting cross-legged in a dim chamber, a small oil lamp casting shadows on plastered walls. His reed pen dips into black ink made of soot and gum. He moves slowly across a stretched piece of parchment, letter by letter, word by word, his hand steady, his breath calm. Outside, the wind hisses across the barren cliffs. Perhaps he pauses to recite the words aloud, letting their rhythm steady him. Perhaps he whispers them as prayer. He cannot know that what he copies will survive longer than his own people, longer than the temple he reveres, longer than his homeland itself. Centuries pass. Dust settles over his work. Earthquakes shake the cliffs. Armies march through. And yet, when that shepherd's stone struck the clay jar in 1947, the sound it made was as if history itself had cracked open. The scrolls remind us of something subtle, that human voices are fragile, but writing, when hidden, when preserved, can be immortal. The desert, harsh as it is, becomes a guardian. Where moisture and mold would have destroyed parchment in other climates, here the dryness preserved them as though the air itself conspired to keep their words alive. Their discovery came at a time of upheaval, on the eve of the founding of the State of Israel, in a region already fraught with conflict. The scrolls themselves became entangled in modern politics, bought, sold, claimed, contested. For a time, fragments were advertised in newspapers, offered to buyers with headlines like "Biblical Manuscripts for Sale." Slowly they were gathered into museums and universities, though even today, disputes remain about ownership, access, and interpretation. And yet, beyond the quarrels of nations and scholars, the scrolls endure in silence, whispering the same words they carried when they were first written. They are fragments of humanity's oldest questions. Who are we? Why are we here? How do we live in a world that seems to teeter always between light and darkness? When you think of them, do not think only of fragile parchment behind glass. Think of the desert itself, the caves high above the Dead Sea, the blazing sun on the cliffs, the stillness of that salt lake, dense and silent. Picture the jars lined against the stone wall of a cave, sealed with clay lids, placed with care. Picture the men who carried them there, hearts pounding, hoping they would be safe. Picture the centuries of silence, the long wait for rediscovery, and then, think of the shepherd, stone in hand, hearing the sound of clay breaking, a sound that became the doorway to the ancient world. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not just texts, they are bridges between past and present, between faith and history, between silence and speech, between a people who lived 2,000 years ago and those who read their words now, in languages and lands they could never have imagined. Perhaps that is their greatest gift, not the answers they provide, but the continuity they affirm. That across time, across empires, across deserts, the human longing for meaning endures, the words remain, the silence holds them. And when we read them, we step into that silence, and we hear, not with our ears, but with something deeper, the voices of those who came before. The bull-headed lyres of Archaeological. In the southern plains of Mesopotamia, where the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates once wandered across fertile land like living serpents of water, lies a place whose silence today conceals a music that once moved through the halls of kings. Ursh, the fabled city of the Sumerians, whose ziggurats climbed towards the heavens like a stairway for the gods, was not only a city of bricks, temples, and trade, it was also a city of music. And among the most haunting relics unearthed from its royal graves are the bull-headed lyres, instruments that fused the sound of plucked strings with the power of sacred symbolism. They are not only objects of craftsmanship, but also silent witnesses of ritual, lament, and the eternal search for harmony between the human and the divine. The story of these lyres begins beneath the sands, where death and music coiled together. It was in the 1920s and 30s that archaeologist Leonard Woolley led excavations at Earl. His spade sank deep into a cemetery that had lain untouched for over 4,000 years. Within that royal cemetery, shafts descended into chambers lined with stone, their contents sealed away since the time of the great Sumerian kings and queens. Here were not mere burials of rulers, but great spectacles of death, where attendants and musicians followed their sovereign into the afterlife. And among the bodies there were instruments, delicate lyres, their wooden frames long since rotted, but their fittings preserved. What emerged were the lyres adorned with the heads of bulls, their faces shaped from gold, their beards inlaid with lapis lazuli, their horns fashioned of shining metal. Each lyre was a fusion of sound and symbol. The bull was not merely an ornament but a being of power in Mesopotamian belief, a creature tied to fertility, strength, and the divine will. The lyre, in the hands of the musician, became more than wood and strings. It was a mediator between the earthly and the eternal. The most famous of these, often called the Great Lyre, bore a golden bull's head with lapis beard, gazing outward with solemn eyes. Beneath its resonant soundbox was an inlaid panel, divided into registers, each filled with mysterious imagery. Animals dressed as men, feasting, playing, and leading others, scenes that scholars have puzzled over for decades. Some say it is the representation of a banquet in the underworld, a symbolic tale of the passage after death. Others suggest it is a cosmic vision, showing how music itself unites all creatures under divine order. Whatever its meaning, the panel tells us that the lyre was never a simple instrument. It was a vessel of story, memory, and cosmic resonance. Imagine the court of some 4.5 millennia ago. The temple precinct filled with incense, the voices of priests rising in chant. Then, at the center, the lyre begins to play. Its sound was not like the harp, nor the modern guitar, but a delicate resonance, strings plucked in sequence, each note shimmering in the enclosed space. The bull's head gleamed in torchlight, its golden face reflecting fire as if it too was alive. Music was never entertainment here, it was sacred. To play was to summon the gods, to soothe the spirits, to bridge life and death. Woolley's excavations revealed that the lyres were buried with their players. At the so-called Great Death Pit, the remains of dozens of attendants were uncovered. Musicians lay among them, their instruments collapsed in place. One can almost see the moment. The queen or noble dies. A procession leads her to her tomb, and with her go the court guards, servants and musicians. They drink from vessels, perhaps a narcotic potion, perhaps poison, and together they descend into silence. Yet the lyre is placed in their hands, as if the last note they played would continue beyond the grave. Music, in Sumerian thought, did not end with death, it endured, echoing in the shadowy realm below. The bull's head, with its piercing gaze, carried layered meanings. In Mesopotamian myth, the bull was the beast of the gods. Shamash, the sun god, sometimes bore its strength. Inanna, goddess of love and war, called upon its virility. The famous epic of Gilgamesh tells of the bull of heaven, unleashed upon Uruk when Gilgamesh spurns the goddess. To the Sumerians, the bull was both terror and fertility, death and life, destruction and creation. Placing its visage upon a lyre was to place divine duality into sound. Each note plucked from the strings reverberated with this dual power. The lyres themselves were surprisingly advanced in design. Scholars reconstructed them, rectangular soundboxes of wood, now vanished, once covered with shell inlay, lapis and red limestone. A vertical arm rose, holding the crossbar from which strings were stretched down to the bridge. Some had 11 strings, others fewer. The tuning is uncertain, but based on later Mesopotamian instruments, it likely followed a diatonic scale, notes arranged much like our modern system. This makes the lyre not only an artifact of art but of science, a glimpse into how the ancients ordered sound and time. But beyond mechanics, one must dwell in imagination. The funeral chamber filled with mourners, torches flickering, the musician plucked the strings, the bull's head looming, sound curling like incense. It was not just melody, it was ritual magic. The notes called to the gods, guiding the soul of the dead ruler to the underworld, ensuring their safe passage. Music was a guide, a companion, a cosmic password. Without it, the silence of death might have been unbearable. The inlaid panel on the great lyre tells us even more. In its lowest register, a scorpion man, a being tied to the underworld, leads others in procession. Above, animals dressed as humans carry vessels, pour drinks and feast. A hyena serves meat, a lion carries a jar, an ass plays a harp. This is not mere whimsy, it is myth and image. The world beyond was envisioned as a mirror of life, where even animals partook in ritual. Perhaps these scenes suggest the very songs that were played. Perhaps the lyre's music narrated the journey of the soul, as these panels narrated an image. What is most haunting is that these instruments buried for millennia are silent now. The wood rotted, the strings long vanished, yet their presence speaks louder than sound. They tell us that in Ur, music was inseparable from death, power, and the sacred. They tell us that the Sumerians, though distant in time, sought the same consolation as we do, to find meaning in the face of mortality, to bridge the gap with sound and symbol. The lyres are now reconstructed in museums. Their gold shines under sterile light, their beards of lapis glow softly, yet the silence remains. No hand plucks them, no hall resonates with their song. And yet, if one stands before them, something is felt. It is as if the strings still vibrate invisibly, carrying a resonance not of physics but of memory. For when Woolley lifted them from the earth, he did not just recover objects, he recovered a fragment of human longing, the desire to weave death into melody, to turn sorrow into ritual, to gild silence with song. The bull-headed lyres of Ur stand as some of the oldest stringed instruments known. They predate our modern orchestras, our lutes, even our concept of music notation. And yet they already embody everything music is: beauty, ceremony, power, transcendence. To gaze upon them is to realize that music was never an invention of leisure. It was a necessity of spirit. It was how the earliest cities sang to their gods, how they comforted their dead, how they reminded themselves that even in silence, sound could endure. Even now, one can imagine the last chord struck in that royal tomb, as attendants lay down beside their queen, the bull's golden head gleaming in the lamplight. The strings thrummed, a note rang, and then all was still. The bodies froze in death, but the music carried on, at least in their belief, into the shadowed halls of the netherworld. That is what these lyres represent, not silence, but the hope that sound never dies. And so the bull-headed lyres of Ur remain, suspended between worlds. They are not only artifacts, they are echoes, frozen in gold and lapis. They remind us that music is not only to be heard but to be remembered, to be imagined, to be carried across centuries in silence until someone, somewhere, dares to listen again. The Pazyryk carpet. Far up in the high, cold lands of Siberia, where mountains rise in jagged silence and valleys are brushed with drifting snow, something extraordinary lay waiting beneath the frozen earth for more than 2,000 years. It was hidden inside a burial mound, a kurgan, constructed by the Pazyryk people, an ancient nomadic culture whose lives were spent traversing the endless steppe. The grave contained the trappings of a chieftain or noble, preserved by the strange power of permafrost. Horses with richly decorated harnesses, chariots disassembled and carefully laid out, finely worked gold ornaments, and among all of this, a single textile that would astonish the world when it was finally uncovered: the Pazyryk carpet. It was not just any woven fabric. It was, and still remains, the oldest surviving knotted carpet in the world, dating back to the 5th century BCE, its patterns and colors vivid despite its long sleep in ice. A carpet that, even after millennia, speaks to us of artistry, symbolism, and the mysterious worlds of ancient peoples whose hands and minds crafted it. When archaeologist Sergei Rudenko and his team uncovered it in 1949, they could not have imagined that beneath layers of soil and ice lay such an intact masterpiece. Measuring roughly 6 feet square, with a staggering 360,000 knots per square meter, the Pazyryk carpet was proof of a weaving tradition so advanced, so refined, that it challenged assumptions about the sophistication of Iron Age steppe cultures. It was not the rough work of nomads making practical blankets for warmth. It was ceremonial, symbolic, breathtaking in detail, alive with motifs that still stir the imagination. But the Pazyryk carpet is more than an object. It is a story woven in wool and dyed with natural pigments. It is the story of connections between worlds, between nomadic steppe peoples and the great civilizations of Persia, between art and ritual, between the living and the dead. To understand the carpet, we must step back into the world of the Pazyryk, into their valleys of stone and silence, into their frozen tombs where time itself has preserved their way of life. The Pazyryk people lived in the Altai Mountains of Siberia during the Iron Age. They were skilled horsemen, traders and warriors, living in an environment that demanded resilience and mobility. Their culture is known to us largely through the kurgans they left behind. Massive burial mounds filled with goods for the afterlife. Because many of these tombs were sealed and frozen, the contents remain astonishingly intact, giving us glimpses of clothing, tools, wooden structures, leather goods, and even tattooed human remains. It was within one of these burial mounds, Kurgan number 5 of the Pazyryk Valley, that the carpet was found. The mound was built for a powerful chieftain, accompanied into the afterlife, with richly decorated horses and a full assemblage of status objects. The carpet, folded and placed carefully, seems to have had a ritual role, perhaps as a marker of status or as an offering to guide the dead into the next world. When first unrolled, the carpet revealed a design unlike anything seen before. Its central field contained a repeating pattern of floral rosettes, framed by multiple borders. The innermost border held stylized deer, their antlers curling in elegant symmetry, recalling the sacred animal motifs common among steppe peoples. Another border showed processions of horsemen, each figure distinct, carrying themselves with a quiet dignity as they rode endlessly around the carpet's perimeter. These images were not mere decoration, they carried meaning, symbolic weight. Horses were the lifeblood of Pazyryk society, the companions of nomads in both life and death. Deer had long been seen as sacred animals across Eurasia, associated with fertility, movement between worlds, and spiritual guardianship. The rosettes may have echoed celestial symbols, the endless cycle of life mirrored in the endless repetition of woven forms. Together, these motifs formed a textile cosmology, a world woven into cloth. The technical mastery of the carpet astonished scholars. The precision of the knots, the clarity of the design, the vividness of the dyes, all spoke of a weaving tradition already highly developed. The knot count was higher than that of many modern carpets, suggesting that the weavers were not just artisans but masters at the pinnacle of their craft. The red dye used for much of the carpet came from madder root, a pigment still used centuries later in Persian carpets. The yellows and blues came from other natural sources, carefully balanced to create harmony. Nothing about the carpet was accidental. Every thread was chosen, every knot deliberate. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Pazyryk carpet is its connection to the wider world. Though found in Siberia, far from the great centers of ancient empires, its style and technique suggest ties to Achaemenid Persia. Some scholars believe it may have been woven in a Persian workshop and traded or gifted to the Pazyryk elite. Others argue that the Pazyryk themselves, influenced by contacts with Persia, developed the skill locally. Either way, the carpet testifies to the existence of far-reaching trade networks in the Iron Age. The steppe was not isolated, it was a crossroads, where goods, ideas, and artistry flowed as freely as horsemen across the plains. The carpet's survival is as remarkable as its artistry. Most textiles decay quickly, lost to the soil, or devoured by time. But the permafrost of the Altai Valley acted as a natural time capsule. When water seeped into the burial mound and froze, it encased the grave goods in ice. For over 2,000 years, the carpet remained in this frozen vault, untouched by decay, until archaeologists finally brought it to light. This chance preservation allows us to see a textile tradition that otherwise would have vanished without trace. But what was the role of such a carpet in Pazyryk culture? Was it spread beneath the feet of the chieftain during ceremonies? Was it used in feasts, a surface upon which offerings were placed? Or was it always destined for the tomb, woven specifically as an object of passage, a bridge between the living world and the realm of ancestors? We may never know, yet its careful placement in the burial mound, folded and protected, suggests it was more than a simple possession. It was a symbol, a treasure meant to accompany its owner into eternity. The carpet also raises questions about identity and memory. Who were the weavers who made it? Were they Pazyryk women, passing down knowledge from generation to generation, weaving not just wool but also their traditions into every knot? Or were they artisans from far away, commissioned to produce a masterpiece for a distant lord? Every thread still carries the touch of human hands, hands that labored patiently, knot by knot, over countless hours, never knowing that their work would outlast empires and centuries. Today, the Pazyryk carpet rests in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Behind glass, carefully preserved, it continues to draw the gaze of all who see it. Its deep reds still glow, its horsemen still ride, its deer still leap through endless time. Visitors stand before it and feel, for a moment, the thin thread that connects us to those who lived thousands of years ago, in icy valleys and endless steppes. And yet, even here, the carpet retains its aura of mystery. Scholars debate its origin, its meaning, its cultural role. Some see in it the beginnings of the Persian carpet tradition that would later flourish. Others see a unique synthesis of steppe art and foreign influence. Its symbolism is rich but not fully understood, open to interpretation like an ancient riddle woven in wool. What is certain is that the Pazyryk carpet bridges worlds. It is both nomadic and imperial, both practical and ceremonial, both local and global. It is proof that even in the remote valleys of Siberia, beauty and complexity thrived, and it is proof that art endures, that even something as fragile as wool, when preserved by ice and care, can carry the voices of the past into our present. As we picture the carpet, glowing under museum lights, let us imagine it as it once was. Perhaps spread on the ground of a great tent, its patterns flickering in the light of a fire. Perhaps honored during feasts, where horsemen gathered, drinking from golden cups, the carpet beneath them echoing their own images in woven form. Perhaps seen by mourners, laid in the tomb with solemnity, its rosettes a reminder of eternal cycles, its dear guardians of the path ahead. The Pazyryk carpet is not just an artifact, it is a reminder that beauty arises everywhere, even in the coldest valleys. A reminder that cultures we call nomadic were not without sophistication, but carried traditions of art and symbolism as refined as those of empires. And above all, a reminder that time, though relentless, sometimes chooses to preserve rather than erase. For 2,000 years, the carpet slept beneath the frost, its patterns waiting for eyes to see them again. Now, in the quiet halls of a museum, it continues to speak, to whisper of horsemen and deer, of rosettes and cycles, of hands that wove a world into wool and offered it to eternity, and in that whisper we hear the past. We hear the voice of the Pazyryk, faint but enduring, carried on threads across centuries, telling us that art, once made, can outlast everything. The Venus of Lausel. Far back in time, long before cities, temples, or kings, there lived a people who carved their understanding of the universe not in writing but in stone. It is from their hands that we have received some of humanity's earliest surviving works of art. Among these quiet echoes from the deep past, one carving stands apart, a figure etched into a limestone wall in a cave shelter in France, now known as the Venus of Lausel. She is a woman of formidable presence, holding in one hand a great horn. Her body is rounded, fertile, alive with curves, yet her face is absent, her features erased into timeless anonymity. In that absence, scholars find mystery. In her gesture they find purpose, and in the horn she raises, they find one of the earliest signs of humankind's attempt to understand cycles, time, and perhaps the very heavens. The Venus of Lausel was discovered in 1911 in the Dordogne region of southwestern France, carved into the limestone of a rock shelter. Unlike the portable figurines of the same era, those small statuettes, sometimes called Venus figures, found across Ice Age Europe, this one is monumental. She is not a figurine to be held in the hand, but a relief, cut into stone, meant to stay where it was placed, meant to be encountered. She stands about half a meter tall, far larger than the typical carvings of the time. Her presence is fixed, commanding, enduring. Her body is unmistakable, exaggerated breasts, broad hips, a soft swelling belly. She is the essence of fertility, of abundance, of life. Yet she does not stand empty-handed. In her right hand, she lifts a great bison horn, or perhaps an ox horn, engraved with 13 notches. Scholars have argued that those notches may represent the lunar months, or the menstrual cycle, 13 cycles in a year, a rhythm of nature tied intimately to the rhythms of the human body. Thus, this Paleolithic woman is not simply an image of fecundity, but a keeper of time, a bearer of knowledge. She may be the first known depiction of the human attempt to unite the cycles of the moon with the cycles of life. To imagine the Venus of Lausel is to place oneself in that distant world. Around 25,000 years ago, in the Upper Paleolithic, the Dordogne was alive with communities of hunter-gatherers. They lived in close kin groups, moving with the seasons, following herds, foraging fruits, nuts, roots, and plants. Their shelters were often caves or rock overhangs, places that offered protection from cold and wind. It was in these shelters that art emerged, not as ornament, but as ritual, as a way of fixing meaning into stone. The Venus of Lausel was found with traces of red ochre still clinging to her carved form. Ochre, that deep iron-rich pigment, was one of the earliest colors humans used, and its presence here is no accident. Red ochre has long been associated with life, blood, fertility, and rebirth. To paint the carved woman in red was to give her power, to enliven her with meaning, to tie her image to the very essence of life. The ochre tells us that this was no idle carving, no casual decoration, it was a sacred act. But what did she mean to those who carved her? Here the mystery deepens. Was she a goddess, a deity of fertility, the earth, the moon? Or was she a symbolic ancestor, a reminder of womanhood, of reproduction, of the continuation of life? The scholars who study her argue endlessly, but in truth we may never know. What we do know is that her symbolism is rich. Her body speaks of reproduction, her horn of cycles, her notches of time. Together, they suggest that the Venus of Losel was not merely a woman, but a representation of cosmic order itself. Think of the horn she holds. In the Paleolithic world, the horn of an animal was more than just bone. It was a vessel, a tool, a trophy. To carve it with notches was to mark it, to count upon it, to transform it into an object of memory. By raising it in her hand, the Venus unites the human with the animal, the female body with the cycle of the moon, the earthly with the cosmic. She is, in essence, a mediator between worlds. The choice of a cave wall for her relief also matters. Caves were places of ritual. They were womb-like spaces, dark, hidden, echoing with the flicker of firelight. In their depths, Paleolithic peoples painted bison, horses, aurochs, mammoths, creatures that sustained and inspired them. But the Venus of Losel was not hidden deep inside. She was carved near the entrance, visible to those who entered and left, positioned where light could touch her. This suggests she was meant to be seen, to stand as a guardian, a teacher, perhaps even as a participant in rituals performed beneath her gaze. Her facelessness, too, is deliberate. Unlike later art that strives to capture individuality, Paleolithic art often abstracts, distills. By leaving her face blank, the carvers made her universal. She is not one woman, but all women, not one person, but the eternal principle of womanhood, fertility, and cyclical time. She could be mother, goddess, moon, earth, she could be all at once. And then there are the 13 notches. These tiny incisions, often overlooked, may be the most significant detail of all. They suggest counting, marking, measuring. In a world without calendars, without written numbers, this was a way to track time. 13 moons pass in a year, and women's bodies followed a similar rhythm. To carve those notches into the horn was to link human life with cosmic cycles. It may be one of the earliest calendars known to us, held in the hand of a woman who is herself the embodiment of life. As scholars have studied the Venus of Losel, they have seen in her echoes of later traditions. The horn recalls the crescent moon, sacred in countless cultures as a symbol of fertility and time. The faceless woman recalls later earth goddesses, the great mother archetypes that appear in myths from Sumer to Greece. The red ochre recalls blood rituals, offerings, rites of passage. In her, the seeds of later religion may already be stirring. Yet, to those who carved her, she was likely not an abstract idea, but a living force. Perhaps rituals were performed before her, offerings of food, meat, or ochre placed at her feet. Perhaps songs were sung, stories told, gestures made to imitate the raising of the horn. The Venus of Losel may have been the center of ceremonies marking the passage of time, the onset of seasons, the cycles of fertility and birth. She was not just an image, she was an active presence in the lives of those who stood before her. Her survival to our own time is remarkable. Carved in stone, painted in ochre, she endured thousands upon thousands of years, weathering ice ages, rains, human migrations, the rise and fall of civilizations. Found in the early 20th century, she now resides in a museum, but her power has not diminished. To stand before her is to feel a connection across deep time, to sense the continuity of human wonder, fear, and reverence. The Venus of Losel reminds us of what art was, at its very beginning. Not a pursuit of beauty alone, but a pursuit of meaning. She is not decoration, but declaration. She declares the centrality of the female, the cycles of time, the bond between earth and sky, life and death, body and cosmos. She declares that even in the deep past, humans sought to understand their place in the universe through symbol, ritual, and image. And so she endures. Half woman, half mystery, carved in stone, holding the horn of time in her hand. A silent figure from 25,000 years ago, still speaking to us across the abyss of millennia, reminding us that from the very beginning, to be human was to seek, to carve meaning into the world, to honor the cycles of life, and to see in the moon, in the horn, in the body, a reflection of the eternal. The golden larnax of Vergina. The land of northern Greece holds secrets older than empires, mysteries buried beneath earth and stone, awaiting the patient touch of time to reveal them. Among these few shine as brightly, literally and symbolically, as the golden larnax of Vergina. Resting in a chamber sealed for centuries, the larnax emerged into modern light not merely as an object, but as a relic that carried within it the breath of kings, the legacy of Alexander's bloodline, and whispers of a dynasty that once stretched across the known world. But before we step into that tomb, let us begin with the landscape itself. Vergina, or Aigai as it was known in antiquity, was not merely a settlement. It was the beating heart of the Macedonian kingdom, long before the more famous Pella rose to prominence. Its hills are gentle yet commanding, offering sweeping views of plains where soldiers once trained, where horsemen galloped, where a culture rooted in both Greek and Balkan traditions flourished. For centuries, this land hid beneath its mounds treasures beyond imagination, until one day in 1977, an archaeologist named Manolis Andronikos pressed a spade into the soil and unearthed what many now call the discovery of the century. The tomb he uncovered was unlooted, an almost miraculous event given the fate of most ancient burials. Within it lay an array of objects, weapons, armor, ceremonial items, gilded wreaths, and among them the star of our story, the golden larnax. A larnax in essence is a small chest, a container for bones, ashes, or personal relics. Yet this was no ordinary chest. Crafted from solid gold, weighing more than 10 kilograms, it bore upon its lid a radiant symbol, a 16-rayed starburst, a motif now known as the Vergina sun. This was not mere decoration, it was the heraldic emblem of the Macedonian dynasty, a sigil of divine power, legitimacy, and cosmic order. Within the larnax were human remains, cremated bones, carefully interred. Were they those of Philip II, father of Alexander the Great, or of another royal figure from the line of Argeads? The debate remains, echoing through archaeological circles, but regardless of whose ashes lay within, the sanctity of the larnax was undeniable. Let us linger upon its craftsmanship. Imagine in some long-forgotten workshop, artisans hammering sheets of gold, burnishing their surface until they gleamed like the sun. The starburst carved upon it was not haphazard. It was precise, deliberate, each ray spreading outward like light itself. The box's proportions were balanced, symmetrical, almost mathematical in their perfection, reflecting a culture that wedded aesthetics with meaning. This was not a trinket to dazzle the eye. It was a vessel, consecrated to hold the very essence of a king. Step inside the tomb in your imagination. Picture the burial chamber as it was found. Walls decorated with frescoes of hunting scenes, weapons laid beside the deceased, armor still gleaming in the darkness, diadems waiting like frozen crowns. The larnax would have sat at the heart of this arrangement, not just as a coffin, but as a centerpiece of royal ideology. To bury a king was to stage a cosmic drama. The gold represented not merely wealth but eternity, incorruptible and immortal, like the ruler's memory. The starburst proclaimed descent from gods and heroes. The very act of cremation bound the soul to divine realms, its ashes preserved in the vessel as though awaiting resurrection. And yet, it is impossible to speak of the larnax without speaking of Philip II. Consider his life. A warrior king who forged Macedon into a powerhouse, who reformed its army into the phalanx that his son would wield across Asia, who married diplomacy and conquest into a strategy that unified Greece under his hegemony. Philip, despite his assassinated death, left behind a legacy that was immortalized by Alexander. If indeed the golden larnax held his bones, then we are gazing at the closest physical link to the man who fathered an empire. But there are those who argue otherwise. Some believe the bones may belong to Philip III Aridius, Alexander's half-brother, or even to other royals entangled in the bloody succession crises that followed the conqueror's death. The debate rages because the stakes are high. To hold Philip II's ashes is to hold the turning point of Western history in a box of gold. And yet, even uncertainty adds to the larnax's aura. It becomes not merely an artifact but a riddle, one that binds us to a past forever, half in shadow. Now let us widen the lens. What does it mean that such a relic survived intact? Most royal tombs of antiquity were violated long before modern archaeologists arrived. Gold tempted robbers, leaving only shattered bones and broken pottery behind. But here in Vergina, chance, or perhaps reverence, preserved a moment in time. When Andronikos entered the burial chamber, he was stepping into a world untouched since antiquity. Dust still clung to weapons that had last been grasped by warriors centuries ago. The larnax still glowed with its golden sheen. It was as though the dead had been waiting, patiently, for their story to be told again. We might pause to consider the symbolic power of gold itself. Unlike bronze or iron, gold does not tarnish. It resists decay, its glow enduring across millennia. For ancient peoples, this was no accident. It was proof of the metal's divine nature. Gold was the flesh of the gods, eternal and unchanging. To encase the bones of a king in gold was to align him with divinity, to declare his soul as imperishable as the metal that held it. And what of the sunburst motif? 16 rays. Some say they symbolize the Olympian gods, others that they represent the rays of the sun, life-bringer and source of power. In Macedonian ideology, the royal family traced descent from Heracles, son of Zeus, and in turn claimed cosmic legitimacy. The larnax's lid was therefore not merely a marker of dynasty, but a celestial seal, a statement that the ruler within belonged to the order of gods. The larnax has since become an icon, Replicas adorn museums. The Virginia sun appears on flags, in debates of cultural heritage, in the identity of nations. Yet its original power remains bound to that quiet chamber in Virginia. Stand before it today, in the subterranean museum where the tombs have been preserved, and the air itself feels heavy. Visitors speak in hushed voices. The gold glows under dim light, not with the brilliance of treasure, but with the gravity of memory. Now imagine life in Macedon when the larnax was first sealed. Picture the funeral rites. Priests chanting, libations poured, the pyre blazing as the king's body turned to flame. Soldiers would have stood in ranks, silent yet fierce in loyalty. Family members wept, perhaps plotting succession even in grief. When the fire cooled, ashes and bones were collected, placed with ceremony into the golden chest. Around it were laid weapons and tokens, not only of status, but of continuity. The burial was not only farewell, it was a proclamation. The king is gone, but the kingdom endures. Such rites remind us that the larnax is not only a container, it is a narrative in itself. Its gold whispers of eternity, its starburst of divinity, its very survival of chance and providence. It tells us of artisans who shaped it, of mourners who placed it in the tomb, of centuries that passed above it, of archaeologists who rediscovered it, and of us, the viewers, who stand awed in its presence. If we listen closely, perhaps we might hear the faint sound of lyres echoing through the halls of memory, the stamping of hooves as cavalrymen honored their king, the crackle of flames consuming mortal flesh, leaving only essence behind. The larnax is not silent, it speaks in a language of symbols and endurance. And so the golden larnax of Virginia is more than treasure, more than artifact. It is a bridge across time. It links us to a world where kings believed themselves divine, where empires were born in the vision of one man, where gold outlasted stone and bone alike. It invites us to ponder not only who lay within, but what it means to remember, to preserve, to honor. In its glow we glimpse the eternal. The golden throne of Tutankhamun, in the Valley of the Kings, in the early decades of the 20th century, a discovery was made that forever changed the way the world looked at ancient Egypt. It was not the first tomb to be opened, nor the grandest of all the royal sepulchres, but it was the most intact, the most complete, and in many ways the most human. Among the treasures found within that sealed chamber was a throne, more than just a seat, more than just furniture. It was the golden throne of Tutankhamun, a piece of art that captured a moment in time, a vision of kingship, intimacy, and divine legitimacy. The throne was unlike any other object in the tomb. Where coffins and shrines spoke of death and eternity, the throne spoke of life. It belonged to the young king while he still walked the earth, while he still ruled from his palace, surrounded by courtiers, priests, and scribes. It carried with it not only the gleam of precious metal, but the subtle details of personal affection, political authority, and spiritual symbolism that together wove the fabric of ancient Egyptian kingship. To sit upon it was not only to rest, it was to declare oneself the son of the gods, the pivot of the two lands, the living Horus on earth. Crafted from wood and covered with sheets of beaten gold, the throne shimmered in the flickering torchlight of Carter's excavation team. Its frame was adorned with inlays of colored glass and semi-precious stones, lapis lazuli, turquoise, carnelian, faience, all the vivid hues that the Egyptians loved, each carrying a symbolic charge. Deep blue suggested the heavens and eternity. Green carried the promise of regeneration, red evoked power and vitality, while gold itself was the flesh of the gods, untarnishing and eternal. Every surface of the throne was alive with meaning, intended not simply for comfort, but for proclamation. Most striking of all was the back panel. Unlike the stiff, formal depictions common to royal art, here was something altogether different. Tutankhamun was shown seated, relaxed, wearing his crown and collar, while beside him stood Ankhesenamun, his queen and half-sister. She was captured in a tender gesture, anointing him with perfumed oil, her hand resting lightly upon his arm. Their bodies leaned toward one another, their gazes intertwined in an intimacy rare in Egyptian iconography. It was not the aloof image of king and consort, but a scene of affection, even of love. This moment, frozen in gold, told a story that stretched far beyond the confines of the throne itself. Tutankhamun had ascended the throne as a child, around the age of 9. His reign followed the turbulence of Akhenaten's revolution, when the worship of the Aten, the solar disk, had nearly eclipsed the traditional gods of Egypt. The realm was in disarray, the temples neglected, the priesthoods diminished. Tutankhamun, though young, became the figure around whom the restoration of order was gathered. His very name, living image of Amun, proclaimed his allegiance to the old faith. To show him seated, embraced by his queen, was to emphasize not only his personal bonds, but his legitimacy, his restoration of Matat, the divine order. The golden throne thus carried both personal and political weight. To his contemporaries, it was a declaration that the gods smiled upon Tutankhamun, that he was no usurper but the rightful son of Amun, endorsed by divine will and supported by his queen. To us, looking back through millennia, it is a window into a brief and fragile reign, into the life of a boy king who has become one of history's most famous rulers, not for his deeds but for the survival of his tomb. The craftsmanship of the throne reveals much about Egyptian artistry at its height. The wooden frame was covered in sheets of hammered gold, so thin they could be bent by hand, yet so masterfully applied that they lay smooth as skin. Intricate chasing and repoussé techniques gave texture and depth to the surface. Lotus flowers, protective cobras, solar discs, falcon wings, all the language of Egyptian symbolism. Tiny inlays of colored glass and stone added contrast, making the throne shimmer as if alive. The armrests terminated in protective lion heads, their eyes once inlaid with semi-precious stone, their expressions fierce yet regal, reminders of the king's power and divine protection. The legs ended in lion's paws, poised as if ready to pounce, a motif inherited from earlier dynasties, and symbolic of strength and guardianship. Lions were not merely animals to the Egyptians, they were emblems of solar power, embodiments of the ferocity that defended order against chaos. To seat the king upon lion's paws was to cloak him in that strength, to declare him lord over the untamed. And then there was the back panel, the scene of intimacy. Here Tutankhamun was not depicted as a distant god-king, but as a young man cared for by his wife. Ankhesenamun's gesture of anointing was both personal and ritual, for perfumed oils carried associations of purity, rejuvenation, and divine favor. The sun disk of Aten hovered above them, its rays ending in tiny hands, a lingering echo of Akhenaten's theology, but one absorbed now into the more traditional imagery of Amun's restored cult. In this blending of symbols lay the complexity of Tutankhamun's reign, the reconciliation of old and new, the weaving together of ruptured traditions into a fragile harmony. The throne may well have stood in the palace at Amarna before Tutankhamun's court moved back to Thebes. If so, it was witness to the very transition from the Atenist experiment back to the old faith. The young king seated upon it would have presided over audiences, received foreign envoys, and issued decrees. To sit upon the throne was to embody the institution of kingship, but also to embody the boy himself, his frailty, his humanity. When Howard Carter's team first uncovered it in 1922, the throne was found among a jumble of other objects in the antechamber of the tomb. Its presence there spoke to the haste with which Tutankhamun was buried. His death, likely sudden and unexpected, left officials scrambling to prepare a burial suitable for a king. Objects from the palace were repurposed, items perhaps not originally intended for the tomb but deemed fitting to accompany him into eternity. The golden throne was one such item, a seat of the living transfigured into a monument for the dead. Yet even as a funerary relic, it radiates life. It is not covered with scenes of Osiris, or Anubis, or the weighing of the heart. It shows a young couple in the sunshine of their brief reign, sharing a tender moment. That is its paradox, its beauty. Amid the trappings of death, it speaks of love, of touch, of human warmth. In the silence of the tomb, surrounded by shrines and coffins, the throne whispered of life remembered. The golden throne is also a reminder of the fusion of art and ideology in ancient Egypt. Every element was deliberate. The lions spoke of ferocity, the cobras of protection, the sun disk of divine light, the colors of eternal symbolism. Even the choice of materials was charged with meaning. Gold as divine flesh, lapis as the eternal night sky, carnelian as the energy of the sun. Nothing was merely decorative. Everything was declarative. The throne proclaimed that the boy who sat upon it was more than human, that he embodied the gods, that he was the axis upon which the cosmos turned. But within that cosmic proclamation lies the quiet gesture of Ankhesenamun's hand. That human touch softens the grandeur, reminding us that behind the titles and the regalia was a boy not yet 20, a husband, a figure shaped as much by affection as by ceremony. The throne's survival across 33 centuries is itself remarkable. Gold does not tarnish, and so the surface gleams today, much as it did when Tutankhamun sat upon it. The inlays, though some have been lost, still preserve their vibrancy. To gaze upon it in the Cairo Museum is to glimpse the very chair that supported a pharaoh, the very images that courtiers would have seen when they entered his presence. Time has not dimmed its power. For archaeologists and historians, the throne is a document in gold. It tells of artistry, of ritual, of politics, of intimacy. It tells of a reign too short to leave grand monuments, but long enough to leave this testimony of kingship. It tells of a culture where objects were more than objects, they were embodiments of ideology, of divinity, of eternal truths. For us, it is also a mirror. We look upon it and see not only Tutankhamun but ourselves, the fascination with power, the longing for intimacy, the fragility of youth, the endurance of beauty. The golden throne is at once ancient and immediate, remote yet familiar. It remains perhaps the most eloquent piece of furniture ever made. not because it is grander than all others, but because it speaks across the gulf of millennia, in a voice that is both regal and tender. The boy king may have died, his reign may have been brief, his name may have nearly vanished from history, but the throne endures, golden, gleaming, speaking still of love, power, and eternity. The standard of war and peace. The soil of southern Mesopotamia holds secrets that seem to whisper whenever the earth is disturbed by wind or spade. In the ancient city of long buried beneath centuries of sand, archaeologists uncovered a strange and haunting object. Rectangular in shape, not particularly large, yet breathtaking in its quiet intensity, this object is now known as the Standard of It is a mosaic, pieced together from fragments of shell, lapis lazuli, and red limestone, all set carefully into bitumen to create vivid scenes of life, more than 4,000 years ago. Though small enough to be carried, it carries within it the weight of an entire civilization's story. To hold one's gaze upon the Standard of is to step into the world of the Sumerians, the people who built the first great cities on Earth. At first glance it seems like a decorative box, perhaps the side of a musical instrument or a chest. Yet the longer one looks, the more it begins to unfold as something greater, a window into war and peace, order and revelry, death and celebration, all captured in a frozen narrative. The panels, arranged in registers like ancient comic strips, tell two starkly different tales. One side reveals the brutality of battle, the other the harmony of feasting. The so-called war side depicts a Mesopotamian army in motion. At the bottom, soldiers march in ordered ranks, carrying spears and shields. Above them, chariots rumble across the panel, each pulled by onagers, wild asses native to the plains of Mesopotamia. The animals are carved mid-stride, muscles straining, legs extended, as though caught in perpetual gallop. Above this layer, prisoners are led before the king, their hands bound, their bodies bent in submission. The king himself is shown larger than the others, a symbol of authority and divine sanction. His figure dominates, reminding all who look upon the mosaic that in war the ruler is both orchestrator and ultimate victor. On the opposite side, the peace panel presents a startling contrast. Here the tone is gentle, almost serene. Servants carry trays of food, jugs of wine, and instruments to entertain. Figures sit together at a banquet, drinking from long straws, perhaps sharing beer from a communal jar. Musicians strum lyres while the king once again presides, larger than the rest, raising a cup in gesture of celebration. The balance of life and death, war and peace, hardship and plenty, these opposites are all captured in the Standard of offering a glimpse into the dual nature of ancient kingship. The artifact itself dates back to around 2600 BCE, discovered in the Royal Cemetery of by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley in the 1920s. It was found in a grave, shattered into fragments, and painstakingly reconstructed piece by piece. Its exact purpose remains uncertain. Some scholars suggest it was a standard carried into battle, though there is no evidence of poles or fittings. Others believe it may have been a musical instrument, perhaps the sounding board of a lyre. Another possibility is that it functioned as a storage chest for precious goods. Yet in truth, its exact purpose may not matter as much as the stories it tells. What makes the Standard of especially striking is its use of materials. The shimmering blue of lapis lazuli, mined from faraway Afghanistan, speaks to the vast trade networks that connected Mesopotamia to distant lands. The white of shell, likely from the Persian Gulf, contrasts against the red limestone, each color carefully chosen to convey life and energy. To the people of this mosaic would have been dazzling, a display of wealth as well as artistic mastery. Even today, after thousands of years buried beneath the earth, the colors still shine faintly, refusing to fade entirely into obscurity. Consider for a moment the men depicted in these scenes. They are not generic figures but living people once immortalized in art. The soldiers, rigid in their formation, embody the discipline that allowed Mesopotamian kings to dominate their rivals. The charioteers, gripping reins as the onagers surge forward, represent the innovation of early warfare when vehicles first transformed the battlefield. The prisoners, humiliated and bare, illustrate the consequences of defeat in a world where survival often hinged on the outcome of war. And then, on the peaceful side, there are the servants, gracefully carrying offerings. Their movements are light, almost delicate, compared to the rigid precision of soldiers. The musicians pluck at lyres not unlike those found in the same royal tombs of decorated with golden bullheads and inlaid with precious stones. One can almost imagine the sound, the low hum of strings vibrating against wood, filling a banquet hall with music that mingled with laughter and the clinking of cups. This juxtaposition of war and peace is not unique to Across history, rulers have sought to balance the sword and the feast, the power to conquer with the ability to provide. Yet here, in one small mosaic, the duality is expressed with such clarity that it becomes timeless. To rule in summer was to fight and to feast, to bring devastation to enemies and abundance to friends. The Standard of captures this balance, crystallizing the ideology of kingship that would echo through centuries of Mesopotamian rule. The setting of its discovery adds another layer to the story. The royal cemetery of was no ordinary burial ground. It contained hundreds of graves, many belonging to elites, and some astonishingly lavish tombs filled with treasures. Among them were the famous death pits, where dozens of attendants were buried alongside their rulers, lying in ordered rows as though still in service to the afterlife. The Standard of was found in one of these royal graves, suggesting it belonged to a figure of immense power. Perhaps it was a king, perhaps a queen, perhaps a high-ranking noble whose life was entwined with both battle and banquet. The very act of burying such an object speaks to the Sumerian view of death. To them, the afterlife was not a paradise, but a shadowy continuation of earthly existence. Bringing treasures to the grave was a way to carry symbols of status and memory into that dark realm. The Standard, with its vivid scenes, may have been intended as a reminder of what the ruler achieved in life: victories in battle, joy in feasting, mastery over subjects, and harmony within the palace. When Leonard Woolley unearthed the fragments, he could hardly have imagined the narrative they would reveal once assembled. Piece by piece, shell by shell, the story returned to life. For modern scholars, the Standard of became not just an artifact, but a document, a record of how the Sumerians saw themselves. In a time long before written histories could capture the flow of daily life, art like this mosaic preserved fragments of human experience, telling stories that transcend millennia. The object now rests in the British Museum, far from the land where it was created. Visitors pause before it, drawn in by the delicate craftsmanship and the bold clarity of its design. Some linger on the soldiers, noting how little warfare has changed in its essence. Armies still march, chariots have simply become tanks. Others focus on the feasting, seeing in it a universal human ritual, the joy of gathering with food, drink, and music. Each viewer finds in the Standard of a mirror, reflecting not just the Sumerians but also something timeless about humanity itself. And yet, mysteries remain. Was it truly a standard, raised on a pole and carried into battle? If so, what songs did the soldiers sing as they marched beneath it? Or was it an instrument's decoration, music rising from its surface in harmony with its images? Perhaps it was something else entirely, a ritual object, a ceremonial chest, a symbolic gift to the gods. The uncertainty only deepens the allure, leaving space for imagination to wander where certainty cannot. What is clear, however, is that the Standard of embodies the earliest moments of human civilization, grappling with its identity. In its panels, we see the emergence of organized warfare, the development of kingship, the celebration of communal feasting, the artistry of craft, and the reach of trade. We see a world that, though ancient, is startlingly familiar. We see ourselves, reflected in blue lapis and white shell, forever caught between war and peace. The city of itself was once a bustling hub, its ziggurat rising above the plains, its canals threading through markets, its people writing on clay tablets in cuneiform script. To walk its streets in 2600 BCE would have been to smell the scent of baking bread, to hear the cries of merchants, to see the shimmer of goods from distant lands. The Standard of is but a fragment of that world, yet it carries within it the essence of life in the first cities. Today, when we look upon it, we are not merely studying an artifact, we are listening to voices carried across time. The soldiers who marched, the musicians who played, the king who raised his cup, all of them are silent now, yet their stories remain, shimmering faintly in stone and shell. The Standard of though small, contains within its panels the vastness of human experience, preserved for as long as the earth continues to hold memory. And as one gazes upon it, one cannot help but feel the weight of continuity, that even in the earliest days of civilization, humans lived in the tension between conflict and celebration, discipline and joy, destruction and creation. The Standard of does not simply tell of the Sumerians, it tells of us all, across every age, bound together by the fragile beauty of life lived between war and peace. The Lydenberg Heads. The Lydenberg Heads rest in silence now, within the protected walls of a museum, but their presence reaches across the centuries like faint voices carried on wind. 7 sculpted terracotta heads, fashioned by hands that lived nearly 2,000 years ago, were uncovered in the earth of South Africa, near the town of Lydenburg in 1962. They had been buried deliberately, hidden beneath the soil, placed in secrecy, and perhaps in ceremony. Each head is hollow, each carefully shaped, each marked with patterns carved and impressed in the clay. They are at once human and something beyond human, masks of faces, yet also vessels of meaning. When you picture them, imagine a line of earthen faces staring back, some large enough to fit over a human head, others small as though meant for children, or perhaps the spirits of ancestors. Their eyes are carved wide, round, and staring, ringed with etched lines. Their mouths are solemn, sometimes small, sometimes elongated, like whispers pressed into clay. Across the surface of the terracotta are incised geometric decorations, lines, bands, triangles that seem not ornamental but purposeful, part of the design of identity. They were found in fragments, broken and scattered, as though the end of their ritual use had required their burial. Yet when pieced together, the faces came alive again. Archaeologists and historians have debated their role ever since. Some call them ritual masks, worn during ceremonies that bound a community together. Others see them as funerary objects, connected with burial rites, a way of guiding the dead toward the ancestors. Still others suggest they were symbols of initiation, perhaps worn by boys or men in rites of passage as they crossed into new stages of life. Whatever their precise role, one thing is clear: these heads were not casual toys or idle crafts. They carried the weight of meaning. To sit with them is to imagine the scene thousands of years ago, a gathering of a community, firelight flickering across clay masks, the beating of drums echoing through air, heavy with incense or with smoke from wood fires. Figures wearing the heads move in rhythm, their voices lowered, altered by the hollowness of the clay. The wide eyes of the masks do not blink, and the decorated lines carved into them catch the light, creating shifting patterns. For those watching, the boundary between human and spirit blurred. The mask did not hide the wearer, it transformed them. The person beneath became more than themselves, embodying ancestors, gods, or forces beyond sight. What is striking is the individuality of the Lydenberg heads. Each one is distinct, not repeated from a single mold but carefully crafted, as though each had its own role, its own identity. Some show headgear, headdresses carved into clay. One seems to wear an animal skin, with incised details suggesting a hide or fur stretched over the cranium. Another bears crosshatch patterns that may have mirrored scarification or tattoos worn on actual skin. They may have been records of how people adorned themselves, or how they wished to appear in ritual. The largest of the heads is nearly life-size, big enough to cover an actual human head. Its heavy presence suggests it was used in active performance. The smaller ones, however, may not have been meant for human wear at all. They might have been mounted, displayed, or placed upon effigies. Some scholars have wondered if they represent different roles within a single rite: the elders, the initiates, the guides, the spirits. To wear a head was perhaps to join with the ancestors, to step into the story of the community that had unfolded across generations. One detail is particularly haunting: the deliberate burial of the heads. They were not left to weather in open air, nor discarded as broken refuse. They were carefully interred, placed into the earth with intention. In many cultures, ritual objects are thought to possess power. When their use ends, they must be retired with respect, sometimes broken, sometimes buried, to ensure their energy is returned to the ground. The Lydenberg heads may have been treated in this way. Their burial was not an end, but a continuation, allowing them to rest within the earth that had given them form. As with many ancient artifacts, their discovery tells us as much about absence as about presence. They are the only terracotta masks of their kind, found in southern Africa. No other examples from the same era survive to provide comparison. This makes them both invaluable and mysterious, a fragment of a larger cultural practice that we cannot fully reconstruct. We are left with speculation, piecing together from fragmentary evidence what role these haunting faces played. They remind us that so much of human history lies beneath the soil, waiting, sometimes irretrievably lost. Yet even without the full story, the Lydenberg heads carry undeniable weight. They show the deep roots of ritual, of art, of symbolic expression in Africa. They show that communities 2 millennia ago already shaped clay into not just practical vessels but vessels of meaning, objects meant to carry spirit and story. The people who made them were not voiceless primitives as older narratives once suggested. They were artists, thinkers, ritual specialists, humans engaged in profound acts of meaning-making. When we imagine them, we can also imagine their world. The rolling landscapes of what is now Mpumalanga, the grasses swaying under sun and wind, a village clustered in thatch and mud brick huts, cattle grazing, children running barefoot in the dust. And within that daily life, ceremonies marking time, the passage of youth into adulthood, the honoring of ancestors, the collective rhythm of the seasons. At such times, the masks would be brought out, placed upon heads, or displayed before the people. Drums would sound, voices would chant, feet would pound earth. For a few hours, the world of the living and the world of the ancestors would overlap. There is also a tactile quality to these masks. Imagine the hands that shape them, smoothing wet clay, pressing patterns into its surface with tools or fingernails. Imagine the fire that hardened them, smoke curling from the kiln or pit where they baked. Imagine the weight of one upon your head, the rough interior pressing against scalp, the small holes cut for breath and vision. It would be heavy, enclosing, changing the sound of your own voice as it resonated inside. Such an experience would alter the self, making ritual transformation visceral. The faces themselves are calm, not aggressive. They stare outward with solemnity, with stillness. Unlike some ritual masks that exaggerate terror or joy, the Lydenberg heads appear restrained, dignified. This may reflect the purpose of the rites, less about shocking, more about presence, continuity, connection. The wearer was not meant to frighten but to embody. They belong to a broader human story of masks. Across the world, in distant cultures, masks emerge as tools of transformation, whether in the masquerades of West Africa, the ceremonial masks of Native America, or the theater masks of ancient Greece. The Lydenberg heads remind us that Southern Africa, too, carried a deep heritage of masking traditions, connecting humans with the unseen. And though their makers are long gone, though their voices have fallen silent, the heads remain. Their clay faces look back at us across time, unblinking, etched with lines that still bear the marks of fingertips from millennia ago. To stand before them is to feel both watched and invited, as if they are saying, "Here is the memory of who we were, carried in clay, buried in earth, and now revealed once again." The Lydenberg heads, then, are not simply archaeological artifacts. They are echoes of ceremony, fragments of lives once vibrant, whispers of ancestors who spoke in ritual language we can no longer hear. They remind us that the earth holds memory, and that sometimes, when we are lucky, it gives that memory back in the form of clay faces rising once more into light. The Skara Brae stone furniture. The Orkney Islands lie scattered off the northern coast of Scotland, a wind-battered archipelago where sea and sky are locked in eternal conversation. Here the Atlantic crashes against cliffs of red sandstone, and the winds sweep over low fields that are as ancient as any place on Earth. Beneath those fields, in the early winter of 1850, a terrible storm tore across Orkney, with waves so powerful that the very skin of the land was peeled away. When the gale finally retreated, it left behind something the world had almost forgotten, a village older than the pyramids, preserved as though time had been caught in stone. That place was Skara Brae. What emerged was no simple ruin. Instead, the storm revealed a cluster of stone homes buried beneath sand dunes, hidden for nearly 5,000 years. Their walls were still standing, their passageways still linked. Even more remarkable, within those dwellings lay furniture carved entirely out of stone, beds, shelves, dressers, and hearths. Unlike most Neolithic sites that leave behind scattered tools or shards, Skara Brae offered something different, the sensation that you could walk inside and feel the pulse of a vanished community. It was, as many called it, a time capsule of the Stone Age. The stone furniture of Skara Brae remains one of archaeology's most astonishing survivals. Because timber was scarce in Orkney, the villagers turned to the stone beneath their feet to shape every necessity of daily life. In their resourcefulness, they left behind something unique, the layout of a people's lives, still in place, still tangible, as though the inhabitants had stepped out only moments before. The village consists of 8 stone houses, linked by low, covered passageways. Each dwelling was carefully sunk into the midden, heaps of waste and soil, which insulated the homes against the relentless Orkney winds. But what immediately captures the imagination is the arrangement within each house. Walk inside, and the first thing you see is the hearth at the center, square and stone-built, the heart of every home. Around it, the rooms are almost identical from one house to another. Against the back wall sits a large stone dresser, a kind of shelf or altar-like structure, always positioned directly opposite the entrance. Archaeologists believe this placement was deliberate, the first thing a visitor would see upon entering. Whether it held tools, ornaments, or sacred objects, its prominence suggests it was far more than practical furniture. It was a statement of identity, perhaps even belief. To either side of the hearth lay the stone beds. One was typically larger than the other, and many have speculated about this distinction, perhaps one for men, the other for women, or for parents and children. The very act of carving out sleeping places in stone gives the impression of permanence, of a family that intended to last across generations. At the foot of the beds were stone storage boxes, watertight compartments built into the floor, likely used to hold fish, meat, or valuable items. There were also stone seats, small alcoves, and even drains beneath the floors, evidence of one of Europe's earliest known indoor sanitation systems. For a community living around 3000 BCE, this level of organization and comfort is astonishing. The furniture itself raises questions about the people who lived there. In the absence of wood, they sculpted their lives in stone, creating objects that would outlast their own existence by thousands of years. Each dresser, bed, and hearth is heavy, immovable, yet their very presence humanizes the sight. One can almost imagine a child sitting on the edge of a stone bed, or a woman laying out shells and beads upon the dresser. The dressers in particular invite mystery. Were they practical storage, or were they shrines where ritual objects were displayed? Some contained small compartments, perhaps to hold prized possessions. A few archaeologists suggest that these dressers had spiritual importance, standing as the symbolic face of the house, an anchor between the domestic and the sacred. The beds, too, offer silent testimony. Covered perhaps with furs, straw, or woven mats, they were not just places of rest but spaces of intimacy and family. The larger beds may have been meant for couples, while smaller ones served children. Over centuries, families lay in these stone hollows, their lives measured by the cycles of the sea and sky outside. The storm that uncovered Skara Brae did not only reveal stone walls, it unearthed the remains of daily life. Excavations yielded bone needles, beads, pendants, and finely polished stone axes. There were gaming pieces, suggesting leisure, and fragments of pottery, etched with patterns that spoke of an aesthetic sense. Whalebone, antler, and walrus ivory had been carved into tools and ornaments. The villagers were not isolated but part of a wider network of trade, for among the finds were materials not native to Orkney, carried perhaps by exchange with other communities scattered across prehistoric Britain and beyond. And yet, it is the furniture that holds the imagination most tightly. At other Neolithic sites, wooden furniture vanished long ago, lost to decay. Here the stone preserved the design of a people's home life in a way that no other place could. It is as though the inhabitants left behind a blueprint of their world. Who were the people of Skara Brae? They were farmers, tending cattle and sheep, cultivating barley and wheat in the thin soils of Orkney. They were fishermen, drawing from the sea that surrounded them. They were artisans, shaping beads and pendants, carving patterns into pottery. They lived in close community, their homes clustered tightly together, linked by passages that provided shelter from the wind and perhaps symbolized their unity. Life in Skara Brae must have been both harsh and communal. The stone furniture hints at a society where possessions were few but carefully arranged, where permanence was valued, where ritual and daily life blurred together in the same small spaces. The uniformity of the homes suggests equality, or at least a shared cultural code. Each family dwelling mirrored the other, each hearth burned at the center. Yet even as the stone endures, mystery remains. Why was Skara Brae eventually abandoned? Some argue that climate change played a role, a cooling, wetter environment that made farming increasingly difficult. Others point to the encroaching sea, whose storms may have gradually forced the inhabitants to move. Whatever the reason, the people left and their homes were swallowed by sand and time. Only the storm of 1850, thousands of years later, could bring them back into light. Today, visitors walk through the site, gazing into homes where beds and shelves remain in place. There is no roof, only sky where once driftwood, turf, and whalebone formed a covering. Yet the sense of presence is overwhelming. One can stand in a room, see the hearth, the beds, the dresser, and feel the shape of ancient lives arranged around that central fire. It is a rare thing in archaeology to glimpse not just artifacts but the very architecture of memory. The stone furniture of Skara Brae is not silent. It speaks of resilience, of ingenuity, of families who carved permanence from the land around them. In the end, the furniture of Skara Brae is more than stone. It is a map of human existence, carved into the very bones of the earth. It shows us how people lived not in abstract, but in the concrete spaces of cooking, sleeping, storing, and believing. It reminds us that 5,000 years ago, in a windswept corner of Scotland, people sought warmth and meaning, gathered by their hearths, and laid their heads to rest on beds of stone. And though centuries have passed, their homes remain, not ruins, but echoes of life, still furnished, still waiting, as though time itself had paused, holding the memory of the Neolithic within walls of unyielding stone. The Genol Lioness. The Genol Lioness is a figure both small and overwhelming. Barely taller than a man's hand, carved from limestone, it fuses the form of a woman with the head and strength of a lion. Its age is staggering, dating back more than 5,000 years to the ancient Elamite culture of Mesopotamia, around 3000 BCE. It was made at a time when the very idea of kingship was still forming, when cities were just beginning to rise from mud brick walls along the Tigris and Euphrates, and when people believed that gods did not simply watch from afar, but walked, spoke, and even ruled among mortals. The figurine is not polished smooth like later Greek marbles or Roman bronzes. Instead, it is raw, textured, filled with intentional marks that make it seem alive, as though carved not just by human hands but with reverence for something beyond human. It carries an aura that resists dismissal. Its body is strong, muscular, shoulders broad and upright like a warrior's, yet undeniably feminine. The hips are curved, the breasts defined, and the stance confident, planted firmly in balance. Above all of this rests the lion's head, slightly tilted upward, mouth slightly parted, as though breathing power into the very air. It is not a realistic lion's head. It is stylized, with eyes that seem more human than beast, and yet sharper, predatory. The combination suggests that this was no ordinary depiction of an animal or a woman. It was something in between, a deliberate merging, a representation of qualities beyond the reach of either form alone. The lioness was strength, ferocity, and dominance. The woman was fertility, life, and continuity. Together, the guano lioness embodied something much greater, a living symbol of power, resilience, and divine authority. The first mystery of the guano lioness lies in its purpose. It was too finely carved to be a child's toy, too strong in presence to be a casual ornament. Its size, small enough to be held in the hand, suggests it was meant to be carried, possessed, and used, perhaps in ritual or as a personal talisman. Objects like this were not made idly. They were created for worship, for protection, or for invoking the powers they represented. Some scholars suggest it was a household deity, a guardian spirit kept close by, while others believe it was connected to temple rituals where the strength of the lioness was invoked during prayers for protection in war, fertility of crops, or survival in the harsh landscapes of Mesopotamia. In Elamite and wider Mesopotamian tradition, animals were not separate from divine life, they were bridges to it. Lions especially stood as symbols of rulers, warriors, and the gods who granted them their strength. Later Mesopotamian kings, such as those of Assyria, would depict themselves slaying lions in great hunts, their dominance over the beast, symbolizing their power over chaos itself. But here, in this figurine, the lion is not slain, it is merged. Its head sits proudly on the human body, suggesting that instead of being conquered, the lion's essence was embraced, drawn into the human form to create something more than either. When the figurine was discovered, it stunned archaeologists not just because of its age, but because of the sophistication of its symbolism. To hold it is to hold one of humanity's earliest explorations of myth, of blending human and animal forms not simply for art, but for meaning. The guano lioness predates Greek centaurs, Egyptian sphinxes, and Hindu lion-headed deities like Narasimha. It shows that long before these later civilizations gave names and stories to hybrid beings, people of the ancient Near East were already exploring the idea of transformation, of merging human and beast, to embody qualities beyond the reach of either alone. The limestone figure is compact, but its presence is immense. It radiates authority in silence, its upright stance challenging the onlooker. Unlike later statues of gods that tower above worshippers, the lioness is personal, intimate. One could imagine a priestess holding it aloft during a ritual, its carved eyes catching the flickering light of oil lamps, its lion's mouth whispering power into the chanting of prayers. One could just as easily imagine it tucked into a pouch, carried by a warrior into battle as a protective charm, its silent gaze lending courage in the face of death. The guano lioness is connected to the Elamite culture, though it was found near Mesopotamian lands. Elam was one of the earliest complex societies, located in what is now southwestern Iran. They lived in close contact with the Sumerians of Mesopotamia, and their cultures influenced one another deeply. The Elamites were known for their unique approach to religion and their tendency to adapt and merge gods from neighboring cultures, blending them into their own pantheon. It is possible that the lioness figure reflects this cultural blending, an Elamite interpretation of Mesopotamian lion symbolism, expressed in a uniquely hybrid form. To understand the lioness, one must also consider the role of women and femininity in ancient religion. In many Mesopotamian myths, goddesses held immense power. Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of love and war, was as fierce as she was nurturing, capable of granting fertility but also unleashing destruction. Her counterpart in Akkadian culture, Ishtar, carried forward these same attributes. The lion was often associated with these goddesses, appearing as their companion or sacred animal. In art, Ishtar is sometimes shown standing on the backs of lions, asserting her dominance over them. The guano lioness, however, is even more radical. It does not show the woman above the lion, but as the lion. The fusion is total. It suggests a being who does not merely control strength, but embodies it. This makes the figurine a powerful statement about divine femininity. In a world where survival depended on the fertility of crops, the safety of families, and the defense of cities, goddesses represented life itself. The guano lioness may well have been a local form of such a goddess, one who fused the nurturing aspects of womanhood with the ferocity of a predator. Her stance is not submissive. She is not crouching or kneeling. She stands upright, shoulders squared, asserting dominance. This is not a figure of gentle domesticity, but of command, authority made flesh and stone. The craftsmanship is another source of awe. Despite being more than 5 millennia old, the figurine's lines are precise, its proportions careful, its expression deliberate. The artist carved it from limestone, a material both durable and workable, suggesting intentional choice. The surface shows subtle shaping of muscles and contours, enough to suggest vitality without overwhelming detail. It is a study in balance between abstraction and realism, between human and animal, between strength and grace. Its survival across millennia is itself a story. Objects so small and portable often vanish, lost to time, buried, broken, or repurposed. Yet this one endured. Through shifting empires, invading armies, forgotten cities, and endless cycles of destruction and rebirth, the Ganol lioness remained intact. It is humbling to imagine the countless hands it may have passed through. Priests, warriors, merchants, collectors, each perhaps aware, in their own way, that they were holding something extraordinary. The figurine today is known not only as one of the greatest treasures of Mesopotamian art, but also as one of the most valuable small sculptures ever sold. At auction it fetched tens of millions of dollars. A testament not just to its rarity, but to its uncanny power to captivate across cultures and centuries. Yet its true worth is not in monetary terms. Its value lies in the story it tells, that 5,000 years ago, people were already wrestling with ideas of transformation, of the fusion of human and beast, of the ways power and protection might be embodied in a single form. The Ganol lion stands at the threshold between human imagination and divine aspiration. It is not just an artifact, but a glimpse into the mind of early civilization, where myths were born not on parchment or clay tablets, but in stone, held in the palm of the hand. It is a whisper from the dawn of cities, telling us that even then, people were asking the same questions we ask now. What does it mean to be strong? What does it mean to protect? What does it mean to embody qualities greater than ourselves? In the quiet presence of the Ganol lions, we hear those questions still, carried across 5,000 years, unchanged, unanswered, eternal. The Silbury Hill Mound. In the green heart of southern England, where the Wiltshire countryside spreads out beneath rolling skies, there rises a mound unlike any other. It is not a mountain, nor a natural hill, but something that humans shaped long ago, with hands and simple tools, stone by stone, basket by basket. Silbury Hill stands as the largest prehistoric man-made mound in all of Europe. Quiet today, covered in grass, it looks deceptively simple, a rounded dome of earth rising above the meadows. Yet within its form lies a mystery as old as 3,000 years before Christ. Who built it? Why was it built? And why, after centuries of digging and searching, does its purpose remain hidden? To approach Silbury Hill is to walk into deep time. It rises about 30 meters high, nearly the height of a modern 10-story building, and spans more than 160 meters across at its base. Its sheer size makes it difficult to grasp that it was made not by machines or modern engineering, but by Neolithic communities who carried earth, chalk, and stone in woven baskets, piling it up over generations until it became this vast monument. Archaeologists have calculated that the hill contains at least 500,000 tons of material. Imagine the work. Families, clans, perhaps entire villages, returning season after season to lift, carry, and dump soil into place. It would have taken decades to complete, maybe even centuries. And still, when the final layer of turf was pressed into its sloping sides, no one left behind a clear explanation. Silbury Hill has never given up its secret easily. For centuries, locals spun legends about it. Some said it was the burial mound of King Sil, an ancient chieftain whose body was entombed within, seated upon a golden horse. Others claimed that beneath its grassy skin, treasure was hidden, gold, jewels, or sacred relics waiting for the bold to uncover them. The name Silbury itself may link to the word sele, or sylph, meaning hall or spirit. In later folklore, the mound was even thought to be a work of the devil, or a place of fairy enchantment. It had a presence that demanded explanation, because nothing so large, so deliberate, could simply be ignored. The first serious attempt to penetrate Silbury came in the 17th century. In 1776, engineers and antiquarians cut into its side, tunneling deep into the mound. They expected to find a tomb chamber, like those hidden in barrows and cairns across Britain. But there was no coffin, no skeleton, no hoard of offerings, only layers of chalk and soil, carefully packed. Later, in 1849, another tunnel was driven in from the opposite side. Again, nothing. In 1968, archaeologists led by Professor Richard Atkinson carried out further excavations, slicing trenches and sinking shafts. This time, they found evidence of how the mound was built. They discovered turf stacks and chalk layers laid down like a cake, suggesting careful planning and phased construction. But as for the purpose, still silence. What is most astonishing is not that the hill hides a chamber, but that it seems deliberately empty. Unlike other burial mounds of the Neolithic or Bronze Age, Silbury does not appear to enclose a king or queen, a body, or a treasure. Instead, the very act of building it may have been the purpose. Communities gathering to labor together, to shape the land into a statement of identity, faith, or cosmic order. This idea of monument as ritual rather than container changes how we see the people who lived here 5 millennia ago. Silbury Hill does not stand alone. Just a short distance away are other great monuments, the Avery Stone Circle, with its vast rings of standing stones, and the West Kennet Long Barrow, a Neolithic tomb. To the south, Stonehenge itself looms, another enigma of earth and stone. Archaeologists believe these were not isolated creations but part of a sacred landscape, a place where generations gathered to honor cycles of life, death, and the heavens. Silbury may have been a focal point in this ritual network, a man-made mountain designed to echo the natural chalk downs around it, connecting earth to sky. One theory holds that the mound was astronomical. Its flat summit may have been a platform for observing the sun and moon, marking solstices or seasonal changes. From atop Silbury, the view spreads wide across the Wiltshire Plain, and in the age before tall buildings, it would have been a commanding vantage point. Others suggest it was symbolic, a giant womb of the earth, embodying fertility and renewal, its swelling sides echoing the curves of the human body. In this sense, the hill itself could have been a prayer in the landscape, an invocation of life's continuity. What strikes any visitor is the sheer effort it represents. Archaeologists estimate that constructing Silbury Hill required around 4 million man-hours of labor. To put that in perspective, if 1,000 people worked on it together, it would still have taken them more than a decade. Imagine the gatherings, lines of people carrying baskets of chalk, elders directing where to pour, children learning the rhythm of the work, fires burning at night as songs echoed across the fields. Building the hill was not simply a task, it was a binding act of community. Everyone who lifted a stone or carried soil became part of its rising form, woven into a monument that outlived them all. Yet the mystery deepens when we realize the builders seemed to hide their intentions. They left no carvings on the mound, no inscriptions, no obvious symbols. Other Neolithic sites often contained burials or offerings of pottery, tools, or animal bones. Silbury offers none of that. Its silence is almost deliberate, as though the purpose was meant to remain known only to those who took part. Perhaps that is the point. Its meaning belonged to its time, not to the future. Even today, Silbury has a strange presence. Seen from a distance, it rises gently, blending with the rolling hills, almost natural. But as you draw near, its scale overwhelms. The slope is steep, the summit wide and flat, and the sheer volume of earth presses into your awareness. Standing at its base, you feel the weight of thousands of years and the labor of thousands of hands. Grass covers it now, but once, when it was newly built, its sides would have gleamed white, made of chalk. Imagine the sunlight catching it, blazing like a beacon across the plain. For miles it would have shone, a mountain of light in the heart of the land. In later ages, people repurposed it. The Romans built a road nearby, perhaps using it as a landmark. Medieval farmers grazed animals on its slopes. In the 17th century, it became a curiosity, a puzzle to be probed and mined. Yet through all these centuries, it remained largely untouched, resisting explanation. Even now, after modern surveys, ground-penetrating radar, and careful excavation, we know how it was made, but not why. Theories continue to abound. Some scholars see it as a kind of territorial marker, declaring ownership of the land. Others propose it was part of seasonal rituals, linked to fertility rites or the agricultural cycle. There are suggestions of mythic resonance. Perhaps it was a symbolic mountain connecting Earth with the heavens, or an axis mundi, the world's center for its people. The lack of artifacts makes every guess tentative. What we do know is that its construction required coordination, planning, and a shared belief that the work mattered. The mystery of Silbury Hill is not simply in its silence but in what it tells us about human beings. Across the world, in many ages, people have raised monumental structures whose purposes remain elusive. The pyramids of Egypt, the great mounds of Cahokia in North America, the stone statues of Easter Island. Silbury Hill belongs to this global family of enigmas. Its builders lived without writing, without wheels, without metal. Yet they dreamed of shaping the earth itself into a lasting form. If you visit on a quiet day, with the wind rustling the grasses and the sky stretching endlessly above, Silbury has a kind of peace. Birds wheel overhead, sheep graze nearby, the mound sits steady, indifferent to time. And you feel, perhaps, a flicker of what the builders felt, a sense of connection, of being part of something larger. When the Neolithic people finally stopped adding to the hill, it was not finished in the sense we think of. It was already perfect in its own way, a monument not to a person, but to an idea. Thousands of years later, its meaning may be lost, but its presence is undeniable. Silbury Hill remains, vast and quiet, a green mound holding in its silence the story of a people whose voices are gone, but whose work still shapes the land, and perhaps that is its true legacy. Not a treasure of gold, not a burial of kings, but a reminder that humans have always sought to leave their mark, to build something greater than themselves, to create in earth and stone a memory that endures. Silbury Hill endures, and in its endurance, it whispers across 5 millennia, that once, long ago, people gathered, dreamed, and raised a mountain with nothing but their hands. And so, another secret of the ancient world returns to silence, waiting for those who wish to listen. Time moves forward, but the past remains, carved in stone, buried in earth. and whispered through forgotten relics. Until we meet again, may history's echoes guide your dreams. This was Timeless Secrets. Good night.